Welcome back to Why Blank Lost, or as we call it this time every season, Why Blank Won, or as we call it specifically this season, How the hell did Blank win?
Yes. Thank you for starting out that way because I chose to wear my shirt facing the proper way, why blank lost, because we really need to delve into why some people lost here, right?
And I,
In
of course,
addition
am
to
wearing mine,
why
the
someone won.
Why Blank Won. I am David Bloomberg, and of course, the other person that you heard or are seeing is Jessica Lewis,
Mhm.
as has been with me this entire Survivor 43 journey.
Yes.
And what an ending to that journey. Um,
What a journey it has been.
Yes. I predicted Jesse would win, like so many other people did,
Mm-hmm.
because that's the way the edit was pointing with big flashing red arrows.
Yes.
Uh, I knew it looked too obvious, but I couldn't not say it just because it was too obvious. I thought
Mm,
maybe producers had learned their lessons.
no.
I was wrong. Um, but in no situation would I ever have predicted Gabler.
Mm-hmm.
Just like 2 seasons ago, in no situation would I have ever predicted Erica.
Mm.
Uh, from now on, apparently I should just predict the winner based on who I'm absolutely certain will not win.
I think that's a great idea. Let's start doing that
Yeah, we'll just,
since we can't rely on anything that we actually see in the show to make the
well, I mean,
predictions.
to be fair, he did tell us he was hiding in plain sight.
Oh, he certainly did. He pretended he was a
Um,
tree at one point.
yes. But um, I mean, even at the beginning of the season. So I have to tell the story quickly, even though I know we've got a lot to go on here.
Oh my gosh, so much.
My 5 teenage cousins did a draft at the beginning of the season.
Mm.
And of course, after going through, they ended up with an extra player. And so they gave that play. I guess they must have ended up with a couple if I'm doing the math right
I
here.
was trying to do the math in my
Um,
head, like how does this calculate? But go
they
ahead.
gave that player to their parents. Their parents won the draft. Um,
Oh my gosh.
so
Well,
yes.
interesting. Well, and I
Um,
will say, even if we were to go back to the very beginning where this all started, when
mhm.
we introduced the world, or at least the listeners of this podcast, to this group of individuals who are playing 43, I think both of us were a little, mm,
Not high on Gabler.
yeah, I'm trying to think of the correct terminology here. Like he seemed fine, but we also were concerned that he was going to be a little bit out there, a little too much, and his personality might rub some people the wrong way. And early on, we were starting to see that very much in
Hmm.
how he was interacting with people in the tribe, and he even tried to get himself voted out on, like, I don't know, day 3 or 6. I'm not even sure,
Yeah.
but it was definitely something that we saw, and I think a lot of people probably felt the same way because there was some question there. How was he going to fit with this group of people? He was the older
Right.
gentleman on the group, and
Which
sometimes that doesn't mesh well.
I will say, definitely glad to see someone who's over 50 win the game.
Oh, 100%. And I always do hate it when age becomes such a factor, but it's
Right.
something that we have to kind of look at and say, well, can they mesh despite being so much older? And this was something
Well,
that was
also,
actually.
it's more difficult for age for a person of later days to win because so few of them are cast.
Yes, and that is fair as well. So there's a lot of things there that are outside of your control, right? When
Hmm.
you are cast, and all of these assumptions are made about you based upon who you are, and age is one of those things. And so we were discussing that as well and curious how that was going to work out for him. I think it's awesome that someone who is in their 50s was able to win. I'm not taking that away from him at all.
Right.
I am very much upset with what
Other
we like
things.
the edit may I mean,
Yes.
who am I supposed to blame at this point? Like,
Right. Right.
I
Oh,
don't even
we'll
know.
find plenty of people to blame as we go
Okay,
on.
good, because
Um,
I give up at
yeah.
this point.
Yeah. Now, speaking of later days, before we go much further, since this is going to be a long one, I
Mhm.
want to remind everyone that really in just a few days, we will once again be getting together with Tiffany Seeley and David Voce for a
Yay!
special postseason wrap up.
Yes.
And considering the way this season ended,
Oh my.
it's going to be lit. So everyone should get your questions in that they have for any or all of the four of us.
Yes.
Tweet them at me, DM me, whatever.
Yeah, please. Because we want to be able to answer your questions and do it in a super fun, humorous fashion with Tiffany and Boche.
Yes, and we only have a few days, so hurry up.
Yeah.
Now, another thing I want to mention is something we always note for these finale podcasts. We unfortunately can't devote as much time to evaluating every game move, right or wrong, for the final five as we normally do.
Right.
Or else this podcast would probably be over 5 hours long. So just wanted to note that up front. Some people, it's going to seem like they get short shrift, or at least shorter shrift than they should have gotten. Try saying that 5 times fast. And there's just nothing we can do about it.
No, because we can't.
We don't want to break the record that Shannon and Dino have for the longest podcast ever. So, but whether we're talking about someone who lost or someone who won or a combination of them all, we follow our usual path of going through the rules for winning that I originally wrote way back after season 1 and have been updating ever since, so we could see how these 5 finalists did while looking at all the non-spoiler information available to us, including plenty of interviews, social media, secret scenes throughout the whole season.
Yes, there's so much.
Yeah. Before we get to the rules, we always have some other things to talk about. Now, we'll keep this section short this time, shortish. But I want to say to start that through the course of this podcast, listeners, viewers, you are going to hear us criticize some of the decisions made by some of the final 5, including, quite frankly, in the jury for 2 of them. This is what we do each week. We analyze the games that are played and we comment with our thoughts. This certainly doesn't mean we dislike those people or we think that they should be attacked online, as has already happened with a couple of them. Although, quite honestly, I think anyone listening to this podcast probably isn't among that group, but it's still good to point out, don't do that. In fact, I was just going to say, in fact, don't do that, but I already said don't do that. The players made decisions that we think were wrong for reasons that we think were wrong. They made those decisions in the moment. They told us their reasoning after the fact. We will look at what was said and done and explain why we think it was right or wrong. It is possible to disagree and still be friendly. We have met and hung out with players whose games we've criticized, whose jury decisions we criticized. There was one particular juror who I said her decision was terrible. She never should have done that. I saw her at a get together and she came up to me and she's like, "Oh my God, David, you're great. You're amazing." And I'm like, wow, okay, good. I'm glad you did not take that personally. And I mean, it bears noting, Jessica is a former player. She has been through this sort of thing. We hope to meet many of the players from this season too. We know listeners to this podcast are looking for rational, objective analysis with the occasional rant, doing our best to consider all the information we have. And that's what you're going to get.
Yes.
So we hope everyone understands that and nobody takes it in any other way.
Yeah. I have so much respect for everyone in this cast, and I know David does too. And as a former player, I get it. I understand. Sometimes you don't want to hear people talk about you. Sometimes you don't want to hear people pick your games apart. But unfortunately for David and I, that's kind of what our job is. So
or fortunately,
that's what, fortunately, but it doesn't take away from the fact that you've all accomplished an incredible feat. You were on Survivor. You got through it. You entertained us. But that doesn't mean that we weren't confused with some of it.
Yeah. Or even angry.
That's fair. That is, I will say there was a very big jaw drop when I
all over
sat
the
on my
place. Yeah.
couch.
Oh,
And my husband was like, "Are you?" And I was like, "Oh my God, what? Oh my God." He's like, "What's wrong?" I'm like, "I think Gabler's about to win Survivor." I was like,
was that when you texted me WTF?
probably. It's like, and my kids even ran out because they were like, "Mom, what is going on?" Because I was so like loud in my reaction to what was going on. They even came out to see it, and then they were like, "Oh," and then they just walked away. But I was like, so anyway, there was quite a reaction happening.
Yes.
So
Yes.
yeah.
All right. Well, moving past that, the first thing I want to mention, again before the rules, is something that happened in Final Tribal Council, but which really isn't going to be covered later. Janine made a comment that Gabler's instincts were spot on about her and Ellie looking through his bag. Like, no, Sammy literally told that.
him he
There were
did.
no instincts
He did.
involved. I'm not
Yeah.
exactly sure why that was aired, why it was aired that way, why nobody spoke up, or maybe they did and it was edited out. The whole
Yeah.
thing was just kind of odd. So I at least wanted to mention that.
Well, and I think that this is another kind of stepping off point from. I noticed there were quite a few moments with the jury where it was like the jury wanted to be recognized for something that they had done. And
Mm-hmm.
so they were like, "Hey, by the way, just so y'all know, here's one more thing about me, or here's one more
Mm-hmm.
thing." And I understand you want your story to be told too. Like I understand that entirely. But that moment is really supposed to be about those three people who were in
Yeah.
Final Tribal, and you are need to be talking about them. And so I just thought that was a little interesting
Yeah.
side, that there was a lot of that happening as well.
Yeah.
And that was one of those moments with Janine where she was like, "I just need to own up to this."
Yeah.
So, anywho.
Yeah. Now, another thing that happened in Final Tribal Council was that Gabler did not reveal his plan to donate his winnings.
Yes.
When
Which
he
is
mentioned
amazing,
it,
by the way.
yes, when he mentioned it, I worried that he'd talk about it in front of the jury. And then if he won, everybody would be saying it was because he said he'd donate the money, which wouldn't be fair to him. And
Right.
not incidentally would make our job even more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And it also could have worked against him if people on the jury were like, what, are you trying to buy our votes here? Come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
From his point of view, Gabler told Mike Bloom he was glad he kept it under his hat. Quote, because I wanted to win this on my own merit. It would have been cheap and hollow if I would have been like, hey, wait a minute, Owen's awesome and Cassidy is awesome, but I'm going to donate this. No, I wanted to win it on my own merit and then make the announcement. And he was absolutely right.
Yes, I can respect that decision and I agree with it wholeheartedly. I think it was the right thing for him to do because you don't want it to be a question that is outside of the game. You
Right.
want it to be based upon the game solely. And if you're telling people that you're doing that, it might sway somebody the wrong way. And so I've never really liked that idea of what are you going to do with the money if you win
Yes.
kind of component coming into the game. It should be based upon their game and not some later promise that they're going to do.
Right. The last thing I want to mention here is that one thing I found interesting was that viewers were not the only ones surprised at this outcome. You could see Owen and Cassidy clearly were too. It was on
Yes.
their faces. They mentioned it in their interviews. It was on my TikTok. So, it wasn't all editing. A
No.
couple people on Twitter told me they did rewatches before the finale. And the season played out almost as if we were there with them, seeing the same thing players did.
Yeah.
That's not a terrible thing, but still, viewers should generally know more about what's happening than players do.
Yeah.
But not this time.
Yeah, no, there was definitely live reactions happening by
Mm-hmm.
both Owen and Cassidy that I think we all their facial expressions were matching ours
Yeah.
as things were happening, and there was more Gabler names being read
Mm-hmm.
and then read and then read again.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure.
All right. Do you have anything else you want to discuss before we move on to the rules?
Oh my gosh, there
Or-
are so many things that we have to
Yeah.
discuss. I should probably just get
Okay,
right
we
into
can.
it.
Anything else that comes to you, we'll talk about with Tiffany and Voce.
Oh my gosh, yes, we will, and I'm sure something will.
And-
Here's the problem. I will say this: that there is so many things crammed in my brain right now
Mhm.
that I'll end up going off on a tangent because there. I mean, this so many things.
We need to
happened.
drain this out. We've been.
Yes.
I mean, I know that many podcasters do a lot of work. I don't claim to be special in this regard when
You
it
are
comes to
special.
preparing. Well, thank you. But I have literally spent the last 2+ days just deep in this, going over all the notes, going over the other
Mm-hmm.
podcasts, going over video. I mean, trying to get my thoughts together.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I am ready to drain this out
Yes.
so that I can start, just okay, let's think about other things
Yes. So let's
now.
do that.
Okay. And I have drinks, I have snacks, I have gingerbread cookies.
You brought
I have
snacks?
we're gonna be here like all night.
Okay, well
So
then I
yeah,
might need a break at some point to
well
go get a
maybe.
snack.
Okay, well we'll see. Um
Jeez. Tell me I can't eat and then you bring snacks.
I mean, it's almost like I changed the rules, kind of like Jeff. Wait. No, it's Jeff Probst. I'll do the Jeff Probst thing. It's always been this way.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Listen,
Yeah.
don't get me started on things
Oh,
I
I
want to
know.
kvetch about before
Yeah.
we even get there.
Yeah. All right. Well, before we see how the final five did, we do need to mention, because we can't skip this, that the rules we're about to discuss come in a
Yes.
shorter and much more colorful version in
Yes, they
poster
do right
form.
here.
Go to robhasawebsite.com/yxlostfeed, scroll down to the poster and click on it and order it. In addition to the poster, we have other ways you can get the rules so you can have them literally on you at all times. We have the poster t-shirt and we have the rules t-shirt that we are wearing both sides of. And
I know, and it's
drinking
pretty
out of it.
funny that people can now actually see them visually
Yes,
at the same
yes.
time. Yes.
So again, go to robhasawebsite.com/yxlostfeed. It's well, you can't order in time for the first day of Hanukkah because that's literally Sunday night.
Mm-hmm.
It would be tough to make it by Christmas, but try.
Yeah.
You
You could certainly just try anyway.
Try anyway, and if not, get yourself a gift. If somebody doesn't get it for you, get it for yourself. You
Right.
deserve it.
Tony, yours is coming, I promise.
Wow, Tony, you're getting it to Tony.
Well, Tony is fabulous. He's the one
Yes.
who gave me that incredible.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. Oh, you see, I see it. You're like, no, let's not talk about that again.
Yeah, let's not talk about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Tony.
Yes. All right. Well, we know you have questions. So do we. There's a reason it took us that extra day to compile our thoughts. We know you expect thorough, objective answers, and that's what you'll get. Some people might not agree at first, but I'm sure we'll have you convinced by our answers at the end. We will go through each step by step, rule by rule, looking back at the entire season as we figure out why Gabler won and Cassidy, Owen, Jesse, and Karla lost.
Get ready.
Yes, you better be ready. Especially for the first rule. Buckle up, Buttercup. This is going to take a while. The first and most important rule tells players they need to scheme and plot. As the season began, it sure looked like Gabler had no clue how to do this. One of the early scenes that struck me was of Owen getting water with Gabler and offering the simplest of deals, that they'd let each other know if they hear each other's name.
Mm-hmm.
And Gabler ignored him and said, well, the best way to handle tribal council is not to go. I had actually intended to make this a TikTok that first week, but I couldn't think of the best way to use it. So that clip sat in my drafts all season long because some reason I felt like I'd be able to do something with it at some point. Lo and behold, Gabler wins and Owen is in final 3 with him.
Yeah.
But I'm not here to talk about my TikToks. Well, okay, not fully. But the point I'm getting at is Gabler started off pretty terrible in the strategy realm. As we'll discuss in a later rule, he came in saying his strategy was to bond with and get to know his tribe mates. And of course, that's a slower process and not doing the same thing that Owen was looking for. Right. He told Rob he played the first part too clumsy and Rupert-like. He couldn't get far because he was too honest. He was out of the loop, and he really only knew what was going on because of Sammy and Owen. And as you mentioned, he almost got himself voted out in that first tribal council.
Yes. And I think that we need to spend a little bit of time really focusing on this as far as Gabler is concerned, because I do think, and I'm going to jump ahead to the final tribal because it was something that was talked about.
What?
No, 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 no. Just listen. It relates to what you're talking about, is the relationship component, right? Is that it did seem like there was such a heavy thrust on,
Mhm.
the relationships that he had formed with everyone. And I feel like there was this weird shift that then that became his strategy, which was like, which, yes, you do need to create bonds with people, but you're creating bonds with people who are then actually playing the game
Mhm.
for you. And then you are going along with, and you are part of that process with that person for sure. And I can understand that and I can appreciate that because that's an alliance and I get that. But it's also, there was, that driving force that we heard people talking about, is that wasn't what Gabler was in those
Mhm.
particular relationships that he was in, even though he was creating bonds and that kind of became his strategy. That wasn't, he wasn't the one that was coming up with necessarily all of the plans. It was more like, oh, I'm with these three people right now and this is what we're going to be doing. And so it's very strange that those things have become so intertwined, and that became part of what was ultimately seen as his strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Now going back to the early days, um, there was a hint of understanding from Gabler. Back in episode 2, if you recall, he was lying down and he was
Yes,
tired. And he
he was
said,
very tired.
I know every minute I'm laying down resting and I'm getting stronger. I'm getting weaker in the game, which was a
Yes.
good insight. He
Hmm.
knew he needed to be talking to his tribe mates. He noted in interviews he'd been a fan of his show since day one, which he'd also mentioned in preseason. So he knew he had to make changes and get better. And he did. I mean, after that first vote, they never went to tribal council again. So we didn't, we saw some other things I'll get to, but,
Hmm.
you know, he did make changes. He did get better by throwing out Ellie's name at the mergatory meal and getting the target placed squarely on her
Yeah, and it was weird because it really kind of went from zero
to
to,
100.
yeah, to 100 like very quickly, because he was so not pushing, not the leading
Mm-hmm.
force, not making things happen, to all of a sudden going, oh, now I need to. And then decided that that was not the route he should take and he
Mm-hmm.
should do something different, and go back to the way he was playing at the beginning, where he was not trying to lead the charge and push things. But it was interesting to see there wasn't a slow build. There wasn't a, I'm going to work up to this. It was like a nothing.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a very crazy looking chart, that goes up
Mm-hmm.
very quickly and comes back down again. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I've been thinking about this sequence of events a lot in the days since the finale, as you can imagine,
Mm.
including having some good discussions on Twitter, which I realize is not usually a set of words that goes together. Good discussion on Twitter, especially these days. But
Good for you.
I do want to particularly want to mention Ren Davis, who I had an extensive conversation with, kind of thinking things through about Gabler's game, like bouncing things off of. Um, and although I did question it at first, I've come around to the position that Gabler really did at least some of these things intentionally. Because
Oh, sure.
originally it was just like, what just happened? You have that shock
Hmm.
setting in, and you're like, what's going on here? But yeah, in the early days, he was seen as clueless, and maybe he was. Sammy brought him in to use as a number by keeping him in the loop, while Ellie and Janine would try to pull things like going through his bag or getting his bead for the idol. But thinking back now, that information from Sammy allowed Gabler to play into it, to pretend to be, quite frankly, dumb. He
Mm-hmm.
convinced Ellie that he didn't even understand the rules of his own idol. Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, yeah, it's gone. I can't use it now. Um, that was the first we saw of his acting, of himself making him look worse to others in
Right.
pursuit of a plan. And Ellie herself said in interviews that she was impressed he held on to that information he had about her as long as he did. We didn't. take that to mean much when she did that interview, other than okay. But
Right.
now it's like, oh, okay,
Right. And this is something that Gabler talked about in his exit press, was that he understood how other people were perceiving him
right.
and how other people were speaking of him. And so he thought, okay, well, if that's what they think of me, then that's the way I will be,
Hmm.
because that's already the assumption that they've made, and they don't realize I'm as smart as I am or that I'm as eloquent as I can be. So I just won't be. And great strategy for him to do that, because it certainly was allowing him to get more information from people. But again, to when you do that, you put yourself into that back seat position a little bit more,
Right.
because you're playing up the fact that I don't really get all of this or understand it, so I need you to help me, and I need you to help me understand. So it can work against you. It clearly did not work against Gabler, though.
Right. Now, among those interviews that you mentioned, Gabler told Rob that dropping Ellie's name at that time allowed him to work with others outside Baca. And he took credit for persuading people to vote that way. Now,
Mm-hmm.
just as I was getting ready to type in my notes that when you put out a name in a merge situation, it usually doesn't take much persuading, I saw that he
Right.
said the very same thing in interviews, telling Mike Bloom, you bring up a name in the middle of a merge, it's probably going to stick. And so that merge, or I'm sorry, that move, which seemed clumsy and vindictive to many of us watching at the time, it immediately got him noticed in the game.
Right. And that is fair. And that is a great point for him to have thought of and to focus on, because at the merge, it's kind of like anyone but me, because nobody wants to go out at the merge.
Right.
And also, you're all getting to know each other. Nobody really knows each other. And so it does take a lot of strength to stand up and say, this person has to go, because then you do potentially put a target on your back. So the fact that he did that and was able to have the willingness to put himself
Mm-hmm.
out there, great. That was certainly an incredible move. But I also feel like it got too much credit, right? Because if you
Yes.
think about it, it's a scary thing to do, to throw someone's name out there, but everyone is like, oh, thank goodness. Because
Well,
now it's like, okay,
and he was safe,
right,
for that
right.
vote anyway.
Right. And so it's like,
Yeah.
okay, you're taking a risk, but you have protection for yourself. So you're certainly not going to be feeling the heat for doing
Mm-hmm.
that. And also, everyone just wants a name at that point. You're at the merge, and whoever we can vote for that's not me, I'm going to definitely be interested in. And if you're coming to me with a story, a narrative that I can glom onto and say, oh, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good. And then you have other people that support that narrative, because you have Sammy, you have Owen, so you're not coming in it alone. I feel like that's an added bonus for you to have all of that. So I don't know if the dropping of the name Ellie should have been given as much credit as it was.
Yeah, and I'll definitely have some more to say about that as we get further on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, now, after having jumped out in front in the Ellie vote, Gabler told us he had to sink back down and become the Allie Gabler. Now, we laughed at that at the time, as we still do now, because we saw him then as being still clueless. But he later said part of his game was to be underestimated.
Mm-hmm.
It apparently worked because nobody in the game or watching on TV thought of him as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
He mentioned to Rob that he wished the edit showed more of his strategy talk, and said he had a lot of discussions through the days and weeks that followed. We just didn't get to see most of them.
Yeah.
In episode 9, Cody approached him to join the Ride or Dies because he saw Gabler as basically a straight shooter, a free agent. Gabler told us that both sides wanted him. Neither were targeting him. At the time, we looked at that and said, well, sure, they want him as a number and they don't think he's a threat. But
Mm-hmm.
the thing was that it didn't matter. He kept plugging away and using that to his
Yes.
advantage.
Yes. And that is one thing that he did exceptionally well, was keep his options open, for
Right.
sure.
Now, it got to the point where in episode 10, I wondered aloud on Twitter in live tweeting how the heck Gabler had ended up in the swing position.
Mm.
He would later say he had been in multiple alliances for a while, moving in and out. He told Mike Bloom he was always in on decisions and most information came through him. He was with Ride or Die, Baca Boys, Coco Crew, so many names we've never heard. Uh, the Underdog Alliance, and no one knew. They just thought he was in their alliance and not going to anyone else. And I have to say, we did see a couple times where he would get together with one group, talk strategy with them, then go back and do the same with another group, giving information back and forth.
Hmm.
I took it as him flip-flopping at the time. I was like, what are you doing?
Right.
What the heck is going on here?
Right.
But in retrospect, it does remind me of what we credited Jesse and Carla and Sammy for doing, which was going back and forth, pretending to be with one group while actually being
Hmm.
with another.
Yeah.
One difference is that I'm not so sure he had as much agency in the decision making process, other than as a go
Right.
between,
Right.
as those other people that I just mentioned. You know,
Right.
as Cassidy said in her interviews, from her perspective, Gabler would just say, "Tell me who to vote for," rather than pushing a particular person.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that that's definitely a fair assessment of those arrangements for Gabler.
Yeah. Now, speaking of Cassidy, as we move to her for this role, a big problem with trying to discuss her early game is that the show didn't provide us with much
It
information
was like
about
this.
her early game. Yes, yes, yes. For those of you only on audio, Jessica just disappeared from the frame.
We
Um,
missed her for like 2 whole episodes, I
yeah,
think.
yeah. It's like, who? Where'd she go?
Hmm.
Uh, we knew she said she was hiding, but geez. Um, while we saw a lot of Gabler, the same was not true for her. We saw that she aligned with Carla, then Lindsay joined for a women's alliance, and they seemingly added James. But it turns out James was actually Cassidy's first and primary ally.
Right.
She was obviously part of what turned into a trio that controlled Coco, and that alliance continued to be major players well into the merge. Indeed, Carla told Dalton Ross that when they got to Merge Beach, she saw Cassidy making bonds with everyone else, which supports the idea that she was working more than just with Carla and James.
Yes.
Uh,
And for some reason, that seemed to not bode well with Carla, even though
right.
it should have been beneficial to that group. Because if she's bringing more people in, then you're going to have more potential support for your voting, whatever you
Yes.
decide you want to do as that group of three.
Right. And also, it seemingly was forgotten by Final Tribal Council, but we'll get to some of
Yeah,
that too.
apparently.
Um, so also Cassidy said that she had to later form bonds with Gabler and Owen because they were left out of the votes and on the bottom. So, she worked with them to get rid of the bigger threats. Cassidy noted several times that she had all the information. She was on the right side of every tribal council vote. She was in the trenches. She was making sure the plan she was in on was the right plan.
Yes. And I also think that it's interesting to note that this was something that, even though it's eerily similar to what Gabler was doing, because Gabler was moving in and out with various people and parts of decisions in voting,
Mm-hmm.
he was credited for doing that, and then Cassidy, it was like crickets
Yes.
for doing that, where
Yes.
it wasn't seen the same way. But I really think it's interesting that she was able to be on the right side of the vote, and a lot of the time that happened, she was the other option, because people were like, we need to vote her out.
Mm-hmm.
And she was able to take that target off of herself by either winning immunity or coming up with some other plan with the people that she was with. So it's unfortunate that she didn't get the same type of
Right.
recognition that Gabler got for doing a very similar type of thing.
Right. Which we'll also get to more.
I know, I can't
No, I
help
no, no,
it.
no. I'm not. No, no, no. I'm just saying. Stay tuned. Uh,
For like
um,
4 hours.
okay. Don't tell people that. They'll be like, ah. Well, actually, by the time you've downloaded this or you're watching it on YouTube or whatever, you can see how much time there is.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You'll know better than we do right now.
Right.
Now, part of Cassidy's strategy was to make sure she got rid of those who targeted her. She
Mm-hmm.
said in interviews that whenever there was a chance to get out anybody who talked about writing her name down or actually did write her name down, she knew she had to cut them before they cut her.
Mm-hmm.
She said she knew if they were coming after her once, it was easy to try to come after her again.
Right.
And remember, I mentioned at least a couple times on the podcast how Cassidy's name had come up and that put her in future danger. But she
Mhm.
knew it too, and she took steps to counter that. The one thing I can think of as to why she didn't get credit for it was, as she explained it to Mike Bloom, she was actively positioning the people and putting them in other people's minds as threats. In
Yes.
other words, she wasn't necessarily stepping out in front and saying, we must target this person now, which
Mhm.
of course would have been ridiculous to do. By nudging people in that direction, she got the desired outcome, but apparently the jurors didn't necessarily see them as her moves.
And I also feel like she is working with people who are a little more seen, right? We've,
Yes.
when she's aligned with Carla, and
Hmm.
Carla is someone that was ended up becoming more of the focal point in regards to that particular group of three. Even James at times is a little more seen. Now, I know that we were just saying that we didn't see her as much because of the way that the edit came together, but it's quite possible that she was more of the quiet of the three
Hmm.
when she was strategizing and when they were going through these things together. Because if each person is out working their magic with their various individuals that they've
Hmm.
connected with, and you don't see that as much, then it's unfortunate for her that she didn't get the credit, even though she was working directly with Carla and James to do these things.
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of an Aubrey situation.
Yes.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
not to reopen old wounds or rehash the old argument or discredit Michelle in any way, because I truly like her. I know she's a good player.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I said at the time, and I still stand by, the big reason Aubrey didn't win was that others in the jury didn't see her game.
Yes.
And while there are earlier examples, it was that situation that caused me to add the special corollary that now resides within this rule, saying you can't just scheme and plot, but you need to somehow make sure the jury knows you did it.
Right.
Now, examples date back to at least JT taking all the credit for work he and Steven did together.
Right.
As this rule says, at least one of the jurors in that situation told me in an interview at the time that it wasn't that they saw him as more of a backstabber or they were bitter. They simply didn't give Steven enough credit for scheming and plotting that he did.
Mm-hmm.
Sound familiar?
Yeah.
Um, a similar thing happened, of course, in Co-Wrong, where I mentioned Aubrey. She spoke at length in Final Tribal Council about what she did and how she played. But much of the jury, they just didn't want to hear it because they didn't see it.
Right.
This continued for players in Heroes, Healers, Hustlers, Edge of Extinction, South African Survivor, at least one season.
Mm-hmm.
Even in one season of Australian Survivor, Harry talked about one of his tribe mates by saying Baden could get to the final two and claim a lot. But what is it really worth if nobody's seen it?
And I think it's almost like this weird mix too, where it's not even just if they've seen it. One, they have to be able to acknowledge it and be willing
Right.
to acknowledge it.
Right.
And then also, if you have people that are sitting on the jury that want to themselves take credit for their own game
Right.
by saying, yes, we did that together. And then feeling like I helped you sit in that seat
Mm-hmm.
right there because of the game that we played together. That can either work in your favor because they might say, you know what? I helped you get there. We worked together and I know what you did because we did this together. Or
Right.
it can work against you because they can say, yeah, I did those things. You were just riding along with me. And
Yeah.
now
Don't
you're sitting
don't
there
take
and
my
I'm not.
credit.
Right. So it's this weird, like, potential issue that you can run into when you are so closely aligned with core groups of people and doing moves together. Do you want to be the Cody or the Jesse?
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of
Right.
discussion about who would be seen as actually conducting these moves. And if you don't have a support system sitting on that jury looking at you going, yeah, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
say you did that and say we did it together. And kudos to you for sitting there because we got there together. You got there as part of our group.
Right. And, we will certainly cover more of that in Appendix B, but it sure seems like Cassidy came into the final tribal council thinking she'd explain her game, and the jury was like, we don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
Cassidy knew earlier that this could be an issue if Karla had still been in the game, because she told Owen at the sanctuary that she had driven a lot of the votes with Karla, but Karla got the credit.
Yeah.
And she said maybe it was her personality because people took her more seriously. But
Mm.
even without Karla sitting next to her, that issue still lingered. Uh, I think as a point of comparison, Karla noted in interviews that she worked closely with Jesse and Cody, but had no idea about Gabler being with them. But when Gabler brought it up, those two on the jury confirmed it.
Yes.
When Cassidy brought up working with people, she didn't get that level of support.
Right. And this is where I feel like that response from the jury really matters. When you've got Cody and Jesse who are very proud of the games that they played, and I feel like they were proud of Gabler for being part of that with them.
Mm-hmm.
That's what was they were exuding that. Like, oh, look at our Gabler, like our ride or die, like he's there,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a lot of pride in that. And so I feel like that worked very well for Gabler, because that can kind of seep into the rest of the jury as they're hearing this pride and they're affirming these things that Gabler is saying. It's helping build Gabler up, whereas Cassidy wasn't getting that same
Right.
recognition or that same response, and so it's actually taking her down. And so it's kind of just this unfair situation where you have to have like a cheerleader. You have to have somebody that's willing to say, yes, this is what this person did, and this
Right.
person did it with me.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I did think that it was good for Cassidy to kind of see this potentially coming and try to get in a plug for her game back in episode 8 when she said in Tribal Council that the others may not see her gameplay, but she's playing. But apparently that wasn't enough. It didn't hit home. It didn't spark anything. I one thing I do find interesting, you mentioned Jesse and Cody. Jesse knew he was perceived as secondary to Cody, even though he was playing hard.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't seem to consider that Cassidy was in a similar position.
Right.
He didn't see her in him or him in her, I guess. But back in episode 9, Jesse said Cassidy was super social and super strategic. We didn't see it as viewers at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And Cassidy even told Mike Bloom it was tough to see very little of my gameplay, my strategic gameplay, and my relationships, because that was such a huge part of my game. So now, one related thing that happened at Final Tribal Council was that Karla asked Cassidy for one specific move that she'd used to set herself up for pre-merge. Karla said that one was to build her relationship with, Cassidy said that one was to build up her relationship with Karla and James. Now, I think that goes back to exactly what you were saying. When Gabler said I was working with Cody and Jesse, they were like, yeah, ride or dies.
Right.
When Cassidy said I was working with you two, Karla was like, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There was no, yeah, you go, girl. Now, frankly, I don't like questions that ask for one specific thing. In Survivor, there's rarely one specific thing. And in fact, there shouldn't be. An evaluation of someone's game should cover everything. Mm-hmm. It's like the people who write to us on Twitter, and they're like, oh, I'll tell you why this person lost. It's because they were left-handed, or just something ridiculous like that. I'm like, yes, thank you. You have taken
Thank you for your help.
Yeah, you've taken our hour podcast and you've just boiled it down. Thank you so much.
Appreciate that.
But it's not just one thing. So it's like giving a final exam with only one question, and the answer is subjective in the teacher's mind, and you don't know what it is. Cassidy prided herself on making multiple small moves through the game, which is how a good game should be played. She was playing Survivor. She wasn't picking numbers for the lottery.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that it's, this format, I struggle with a little bit. I know I'm just talking about the final jury format, but before, where it was one question or one comment from the jury, and then everyone kind of got to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I do miss the fact that they don't allow like an opening and like
Yes.
closing statement by each of the players, because I do feel like that can be beneficial because it can structure things a little bit for
Right.
them
Right.
and say the things they want to say in case they're not given an opportunity to say those things.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right, but also I do think a good player, at least for an opening statement, can take any initial question almost and turn it into their opening
Oh,
statement.
and we did see that with
Right.
really like the first question that was asked. That was
Right.
kind of what everyone did, and I know we haven't talked about Owen yet, but I do think that can kind of set the stage, and so at least they were able to do that in this situation
Right.
because of the question they were asked.
Yeah. Now I will note that, and this goes back to something you mentioned too. Probably should have brought it up at the time. Jesse told Gordon Holmes there were a number of times when Cassidy thought, his words, she had agency, but in Jesse's mind, she didn't. One example that we saw was in Final Tribal Council, but he indicated that there were others where her name came up and he flipped it. Earlier, you talked about she worked with others to flip it.
Mm-hmm.
And we did indeed see her name come up. You know, we mentioned this, but there were often multiple names floated. He played based on what was good for himself, not to save her.
Right.
And in the meantime, she's over here, like you said, working to keep her name out of people's mouths.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's a case where, and we could do, I'm going to say, this is going to come up again. We could do a whole podcast, not just on Survivor, but like in theory on the whole concept where two people lived the same experience in two
Yes.
different ways and they
Mm-hmm.
aren't going to see things the same way.
No,
Um,
I think this is part of the issue with the structure of this game, and it's not a bad issue. It's just
right,
a thing. Everyone has gone through this experience, and everyone has has a different perception of what has happened. Because if you think about it, all the people sitting in the jury, they're frustrated, they're angry, right?
right.
Because they're not sitting in those final three seats, and that does have an effect on you, and everyone is going to be looking at their experience
Mm-hmm.
through their eyes and how it felt to them in that moment, and not necessarily wanting to praise the person who's sitting there because you're like, god damn it, I'm not sitting there. And and that can be a frustrating thing to
Yeah,
feel.
yeah. Um, and so to me it's like I don't know, many people have seen this, some probably haven't. There's to show this, there's an illustration of three blindfolded people trying to determine what an elephant is by feel. One's at the
Mm,
trunk, one's at the leg, one's at the tail, and
right.
obviously you're going to get three very different opinions of what this animal is based on those three people.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
um and so you know it sometimes it's a situation where you can't say easily who is right and who is wrong
Right.
when the show didn't tell us,
Yes.
because it's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily important to the show who's right and wrong. It's important to
Right.
put on an entertaining TV show.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to you and me and our listeners to know who's right and wrong,
Right.
but that's not what Jeff Probst is concerned about quite often.
Right.
Because as I was just saying, so Jesse is saying, no, I was doing that. But then you had Sammy saying in interviews that he fell to the Cassidy curse.
Yes. My
And
god,
that,
there was a Cassidy curse.
yeah, and that she, like Jesse, was a mafia boss who would slit your throat if you said her name.
Mm-hmm.
So there was clearly a disconnect there.
Yes, for sure.
And also, by the way, you can now purchase Cassidy Kirch merchandise on her store. So
Seriously?
yes, this is
Oh,
an
I love this.
unpaid sponsorship. So
I like
uh,
that.
all right. So we've spent a lot of time already on the winner and runner up because, well, they were the winner and runner up. It was necessary to
Mm-hmm.
delve deep into this aspect of their game. Let's move to Owen, who unfortunately didn't have as much going on strategically, though not for lack of trying.
Right.
Owen said in interviews he didn't have any illusions going into Final Tribal Council. He was going to win or that he had played a masterful strategic game because we saw what happened and the Charlie Brown position in which he found himself.
I know.
But he certainly tried, and things just often didn't go his way.
Yeah.
We already talked about him trying to reach out to Gabler early and running into a wall. He was really not on the right tribe for strategizing early, which I guess ended up okay because pre-merge Mariah was the only vote that they had to worry about.
Right.
At the merge, though, things went sideways for him fast when his idea, his plan of a tribal alliance went to hell in a handbasket thanks to Gabler.
Yeah.
And then it was just one thing after another.
Yeah, he was definitely digging up from a very deep hole that he had been put into, which we have seen can work for people in the final tribal, that idea of being the underdog, which I think he tried to sell, but I think he sold himself short in telling that story and that version to the final jury as I sat there. But I do think that he found himself in a really tough spot because he was trying to strategize. But as you said, in the beginning, no one really wanted to strategize. And he even said that this season was kind of boring, really, when it came to people's willingness to do things. And it really didn't start happening until towards the end of the game. And by then, everyone's kind of locked into where they're going to be and how they're being perceived. And unfortunately, he never had a chance to really.
He was locked out. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, Owen, that's just sad.
Yeah. I mean, he said in the secret scene for the finale that he knew he'd been a passenger chasing the bus around.
Yes.
It was the situation he found himself in. We separately heard from him how he was, the constant underdog. He thought coming in he was going to play a brilliant game, but it didn't happen. I really do think if you throw Owen into almost any other Survivor season, he would have played a brilliant strategic game. He just couldn't get revved up here.
Yeah, and I really think it's a great point that you make because the best laid plans, right? This is something we've talked about when people are asked, how are you going to play the game of Survivor? Well, you kind of have to play it depending upon where you end up and who you end up with, because some things are just outside of your control. And he tried right off the rip to start strategizing and was really shut down by everyone he approached in regards to the name thing you've already mentioned. Like, if I hear your name, I'll let you know. And it just kind of like fell flat, and they were like, whatever. And you're like, wait, what? That's what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be having these conversations, and you're supposed to be trying to figure out what's going to happen and who's going to be with who. And I think also with that tribe dynamic, there was such a split between the men and the women, and the perception that the men weren't doing anything. And so I think that he kind of fell into that, like, well, I guess we're not really strategizing then, because this is what everyone else is doing and this is what's happening. Unfortunately for Owen, he really wanted to strategize. And so that's just too bad. That's where he found himself.
Yeah. Now, moving on, the one person who definitely did rev up and strategize was Jesse.
Yes.
Through much of the season, we've talked here about how he would gain someone's trust and then vote them out over and over again. He did it to literally his whole starting tribe and then some. We wondered what kind of cult leader-like powers he had. And Owen somewhat answered that in talking to Mike Bloom, saying for whatever reason, he just has this way of, it's hard to vocalize, but he was so good at managing my feelings and understanding and empathizing and knowing how to approach that conversation. It shows like that he's the best player of our season. He's a masterful social player, obviously a brilliant strategist.
And I think that, go ahead.
I was just going to say, similarly, Sammy told Mike that Jesse was someone whose name he couldn't say or else he'd be gone. And he added to Dalton that he was blinded by Jesse and Cody. I have called Jesse a cult leader. I just did. I stand by it. I just hope he literally never decides to make that his career, because I feel like he'd be a little too successful.
It is really amazing how well he could adjust the manner in which he was interacting with people based upon what the needs were of that person. And he did it in such a non-threatening way. And I'm curious if it had anything to do with the current career path he is. He is now finding himself. I know he just completed his master's, PhD. So, and so like for him, you really need to have a true understanding of people in order to do the survey work that he was talking about, and the job that he has. And I think that on top of that, and we've talked about this as well, is his backstory is one where I think he's a little more empathetic, because he's been through a lot of really terrible things that allows him to appreciate an interaction with somebody a little bit more because of that empathy he has. And so it's just kind of an incredible combination for a Survivor player to have that backstory, to have the educational component and the career path that he has chosen, and then to put it all together so beautifully was really, really incredible, because he was able to manage it throughout the entire season.
Yeah. Right. I mean, we saw so many examples of Jesse playing a good strategic game. It's hard to narrow it down to just a few, especially in a podcast about 5 people. One of the more recent, a more recent one that we talked about last week was just the way he pushed the wedge between Karla and Cassidy, assuring Karla that he'd lie to Cassidy about what had been said, and then immediately telling Cassidy that everything she'd heard about Karla was true. But going all the way back to the second episode, Justine told Mike Bloom, remember her? Told Mike Bloom that Jesse
wasn't really she a salesperson?
Yes, evil salesperson. But she told Mike Bloom that Jesse was really good at playing both sides, and there was never a time where she didn't trust him. And that was something that continued through the season. Pretend to be with one group, actually be with another. Boom.
Yeah. He just did it so well.
Yeah. And then, of course, that, came all the way up to the Cody blind side, because he was able to read the lay of the land, see where he stood in relation to Cody within the game. And Jesse said in interviews that if he made it to Final Tribal Council, he wanted there to be no doubt he played the best game. Cody being there would have created doubt. Cody was his social shield, and Jesse kept being in position to dictate things, but people didn't see it because of that shield until he got rid of the shield.
Right. And I really think that this is one of those moments where when you do have those duos, you have to have some type of separation. And we talked about this, I think it was last week, where Gabler actually reminded, I think it was Cassidy and it was Jesse, about the other half of their duo, and then how are you going to separate yourself from that person if you're sitting next to them in Final Tribal? So planting that seed. And we talked about that, and Jesse probably had already been considering it, but it changes when you hear someone else say it as well, because it does reaffirm the concerns that you have. And so the fact that he recognized that and said, you know what? Yeah, I don't want that to be a question. So we need to nip that in the bud. And that he did it in such a fashion.
Yeah.
It's very incredibly impressive.
Yeah. Now, even when he wasn't making specific moves, one thing that I have previously noted is how he kept emphasizing the whole thing about trust being currency. And if you spend too much time examining it to see if it's fake, then people will worry about you. And as I have mentioned, this was awfully convenient for him, because he was the one asking people and getting people to trust him. Of course, he didn't want people to examine it, and yet it worked.
Yeah. No, you put that thought in their mind, and then that's what they're going to continue to think about.
Right. Now, finally, in this group, we have Karla. In the beginning of the game, she was in a spot similar to Jesse, and we noted as much at the time. She was with Lindsay, Cassidy, and James, but also pretending to be with Gio and Ryan. She played the middle, brought information back and forth. Then, even when Lindsay, someone on the side she wanted to go with, even when Lindsay made her nervous, she convinced her allies to take her out while making it seem to the other two, Gio and Ryan, that they were indeed solid, thus making her position even better and, of course, enabling the Gio blind side.
Yeah, she was in a very interesting position as well, because it seems to be a theme that was happening throughout this entire season with so many people who were infiltrating various groups and managing to keep that information secret, which is amazing that they were able
Hmm.
to do so. I think some people were more recognized for doing that than others, but she was certainly someone who we saw doing just that and managing that information really well, and helping lead the charge in certain decisions. And I know at the time the Lindsay vote all kind of had us scratching our heads a little bit,
Hmm.
because you're taking out someone who
Right.
is part of your core group, but it's long-term thinking at that point, which is what I think they were all doing in their concern with Lindsay moving forward with them.
Yeah. Um, then, sorry, moving forward, at the merge, she spread her wings and made some more allies. We heard how she immediately gained the trust of Jesse, but we didn't really know why for sure until interviews when we found that indeed it was because of their similar backgrounds, which
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Yes.
But Carla also had a way of talking people into situations. Maybe not quite as cult like as Jesse, but she could certainly be convincing.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned that she worked with Jesse, but also Cody and Sammy, and she continued with James and Cassidy and several others as was necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, she definitely had a gift for talking to people in a way that would get them to consider the options, but it never came across as problematic for her until towards the end of the game. It was like all of a sudden she snuck up on everyone and they were like, "Oh no, wait, she's really great at this." And
Yeah,
we need to watch out for this, because if she gets in the final 3, she's going to be able to communicate things really, really well.
yeah. Um, so Carla continued and played well post merge, but eventually drew enough attention to have people worrying about her, targeting her, or at least taking away some of her power. She fought hard to avoid that, but by the time Final Five arrived and she no longer had an idol and she'd fallen out with Cassidy, she said in interviews that she knew her game was done,
Mm,
that she had one final bullet. It wasn't a great bullet because it could blow up in her face, but she probably figured her metaphorical gun was useless at that point anyway if you don't fire the bullet. So she threatened Cassidy with poisoning the jury against her if Cassidy voted her out. Now, my opinion in this matter is similar to what I heard or interpreted Owen expressing in interviews, which is that it's not something I would personally do,
mm-hmm.
but I also wouldn't tell someone they shouldn't try just about anything to be able to stay when they know they're doomed otherwise.
Yeah.
Is it a bad look? Yes, for many people it is.
Mm-hmm.
Is it also a last ditch move that a player should be free to make if they choose? Also, yes. I've previously criticized the move when I've seen it attempted on Big Brother, but in the end, it's up to the player. You never want to leave the game and wonder what would have happened if you just fired off that last shot.
Yeah, and I feel like this is one of those situations that is it was uncomfortable to
Mm-hmm.
hear that happening, but it's also something that unfortunately happens in this game, regardless of telling the person that you're going to
Mm-hmm.
do it. Because if you have a bad relationship with someone in the game and that person then gets voted out and goes to the jury, guess what the jury does?
Right.
They talk.
Yeah.
They definitely talk, and they talk about you and they talk about the other players and what you're doing. And sometimes I think people are disingenuous, and because there's that whole perception, and everyone, your elephant example,
Mm-hmm.
depending on what you saw and what you experienced, is going to come across a little bit differently. But I think you put the other player in a really, really unfair position at that point,
Yes.
because what is Cassidy supposed to do? Is she supposed to say, "Oh, okay, well then I'm not going to put you on the jury because I don't want you speaking ill of me. Rather, I want you sitting next to me in the final 3 speaking ill of me."
Right.
It's like it's a no-win situation for Cassidy, because she can't keep her sitting next to her because she's still going to do the same thing
Right.
likely, and Carla will get more credit for the game
Mm-hmm.
because they were a duo. Or you take the chance and you put her on the jury and hope for the best, and hope that you have a cheerleader on the jury that's going to say, "But no, that's not correct, or that's not true, and this is why," and have them
Right.
discuss it. I feel
Right.
like you're better off taking that risk of putting the person on the jury and just hoping that you have some cheerleaders that will help support your game, even if someone is going to not support your game.
Right. And the thing is, I said, I have no problem with trying to make the move in the game.
Mm-hmm.
The problem I do have is if they then follow through.
Yeah.
Now, this is mostly an Appendix B type of thing, but I'm, going to do something that I say you can't do and talk about it here because we just discussed it as part of Karla's last-ditch strategy. So it makes sense to discuss it now.
Mm-hmm.
In this particular case, Karla said in interviews, no, she didn't follow through. Cassidy said in interviews that someone at Ponderosa told her that they heard Karla bad-mouthing her, but that was all the details she got. That's all we really know.
Mm-hmm.
It's, once again, quite possible for both to be true.
Right.
We know there was a jury gathering to discuss thoughts on the finalist games. Karla was part of that gathering.
Right.
She could have been talking about her opinions of Cassidy's which clearly were not the highest. That could have been seen as bad-mouthing by whoever it was that told Cassidy.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. We may never know. I do think if Karla were hardcore poisoning the jury, someone would let the secret out.
Yeah.
They say the only way to keep a secret between two people is if one of them are dead. Well, this is like a 9-person, 8-person secret here.
Right.
So if that were happening, I do think someone would squeal.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of space between giving negative opinions and poisoning and a lot of interpretation in there.
Sure. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
We don't know where it is.
This is why Ponderosa videos would be really awesome.
Well, I don't think they'd have shown us a video of that anyway.
No, but it just, Jury Speaks videos, anything like that.
Yes. Jury Speaks videos. Ooh, I'll get into that. But yeah.
Would have been awesome.
So yeah. All right. That was rule 1.
For an hour and 7 minutes.
I mean, we had some stuff before it. It wasn't all.
We did, okay.
But yes, we are now at the point where some of our individual podcasts, we'd be saying, see ya. But most of the rest of the rules should go quicker. We hope. So the second rule says not to scheme and plot too much and to keep your scheming secret. In this case, it makes sense to work backwards and start with Karla because one main reason she was targeted was due to other people catching on to her scheming and strategic ability.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
She took the lead in a number of discussions that put her front and center in talking about who should go. But she wasn't targeted earlier in large part because, as she noted in interviews, she was working with Jesse and Cody, among others. So they had or could put together a majority. That meant there was no need to make a big move too soon, at least not as individuals. They could wait for other people to do it and then knock them out one by one.
Right.
Now, Jesse took a similar view as Karla did. And even more so because he also had Cody as a shield for most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about the earlier on, the risk of them flipping against the Vessi-Baca alliance for that exact reason and said you don't want to make a move too soon. But he balanced it by noting you also don't want to play someone else's game.
Right.
And he said just before making the biggest move of the game, I'm trying not to make too many big moves. And it was true right up until that moment.
Right. And I feel like this is where he and Karla were very similar in their approach to the game because it was kind of a slow build until all of a sudden it wasn't. Mm-hmm. And, Karla, it happened a little bit more quickly than for Jesse because people were seeing her a lot sooner towards the end and realizing that she was going to be a potential issue for them. And I think also we came down to the end of this game with so many like duos left together, which was kind of fascinating, that then it's like, who's going to take who out first? Right. And I think that that's part of what we saw as well. So, the duo component could certainly benefit your game, but then it can also be problematic for you as well when you get down to it.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the duo, I do want to note, some people have said that Jesse made the move too soon against Cody, that he should have waited and let Cody get to Final Four and then take him out. That would have constituted a huge risk. Cody was no challenge slouch. We saw him lose his last challenge to Cassidy by like 2 seconds.
Right. Yeah.
Allowing Cody to get to Final Four would mean Cody could win immunity or he could make fire. Either puts him into Final Three, and Jesse worried he would lose to Cody at that point for some of the very real reasons that Cassidy was criticized by the jury.
Yeah.
Jesse made the move at exactly the right moment. He got himself to Final Four and had to hope he could win immunity, win at fire, or convince whoever did win immunity not to put him at fire.
Right.
Unfortunately for him, he missed on all three fronts. But it was still his best option to get the win, not just to get second or third place.
Right. And I think it was like the perfect storm that came together because he had Cody's idol again. Mm-hmm. He had Janine's idol that no one knew about. And I really think it hinged upon that idol being returned to him the very minute before they went to tribal council, where it was like, yes, this is what I have to do right now because this is the only chance I'm going to have to do this.
Yes. All right, continuing our backwards move here, we have Owen. Considering we talked about him not being able to get a strong foothold in the strategizing area, I don't think we had to worry about him overdoing it, but Owen himself worried about it early on with good reason. He told Mike Bloom, I wear glasses. I'm Asian. I knew if I came out being really aggressive strategically, I'd be the first one to go. All very smart, observant thinking on his part.
Yeah.
But what he didn't realize, as he continued, was that Ellie would take a simple offering similar to the one he made Gabler of saying, oh, I'll let you know if I hear your name, as, quote, some sinful thing to do. So I was a little surprised that I got painted as being anxious or overly strategic or whatever, which, I mean, quite frankly, may go back to what he was saying about initial opinions based on other factors like appearance.
Yeah. And again, we've already addressed the fact that he just found himself on the wrong tribe in regards to his desire to want to strategize.
Yeah. Yeah. Any strategizing on that tribe was over strategizing.
Right. And it was merely just, hey, if I hear your name.
Yeah. What? How dare you?
This is Survivor, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that what we're playing? Yeah.
No. This is Kumbaya. Now, after the merge, I, again, don't think Owen had to worry too terribly about this one. Though at one point, James did say something about him flip-flopping and being dangerous because of that. But at that point, I don't think Owen was so much flip-flopping as just trying to find a place to land.
Yeah, and he kept landing in the wrong place. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, similar to Owen, we spent a long time in the first rule discussing how Cassidy was perceived as not scheming and plotting enough, let alone too much. But avoiding a problem here was also intentional on her part, as we also talked about how she emphasized making the small moves instead of going for the big moves.
Right.
So, yeah, I think she was fine in this rule.
And I do think it's unfortunate that now I feel like Survivor is in a place where if you become too seen too soon, you go home that much early. So it's there's this desire and this want to play in the back a little bit, which is then having this negative effect on people like Cassidy who don't put themselves out there in the forefront because they don't want to get sent home right away. They want to be able to make it to the end. And yeah, unfortunately, I think that's a lot of what we saw.
Yeah. Now, finally getting to Gabler, we again have an under the radar player. In his case, he said in interviews that although he was in an alliance with every person at one time or another, people didn't notice it. And, you know, I already referenced Carla not even realizing that her allies, Jesse and Cody, were working closely with Gabler. Even beyond that, Gabler added in those interviews that although he was involved in getting rid of people, he did it in a way that kept his hands clean. I agree, because the general consensus among both viewers and most of the players was that he wasn't the one driving the vote. So therefore, he also wasn't tagged with scheming too much.
Right. Yeah. All fair.
All right. See, we made it through Rule 2 in much less than an hour.
Look at that. Like 7 minutes.
Yeah. All right.
Crazy.
The third rule, I'm going to tell you, all the rest of the rules won't be that quick. Uh, the third rule tells players to be flexible. Considering all we talked about in the first rule regarding how Gabler said he played, how do you think he did here?
Well, it's interesting because I feel like he created those relationships that he talked about and was able to talk to many people and form these multiple alliances that you discussed, the Baka Boys, the Ride or Die,
Coco
the
Crew, yeah.
Coco Crew, all of these things.
Cuckoo for Coco Crew, yeah.
All of these things. So clearly he was flexible in his options and he was keeping those options open and not turning down people, even though very early on he turned down Owen. So there's kind of this weird, like, no, we're not going to do that. But then I want to do that kind
Mm-hmm.
of gameplay that was a little bit confusing. And then also, he really had it in for Ellie. So it's like he was really locked in wanting to get Ellie out. And then he wasn't willing to strategize with Owen, but then he wanted to form relationships with everyone and have all of these options available to him with various alliances. So it's kind of a mixed bag, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It was kind of an evolution. Based
Oh,
on what we heard and saw from Gabler, he was being very flexible later on to the same point, or to the point that it seemed like he was basically saying, tell me how to vote, and then going with it. He
yeah,
even told Rob, the way to get to the end is to be flexible and have multiple plans, which of course is 100% correct and
yeah.
practically quoting this rule. But as some of the specifics, Gabler said in interviews that he kind of took a page out of Sandra's Anybody But Me book,
Mm-hmm.
but changed it to any threat anytime they're available.
Right.
Now, on the one hand, that seems kind of obvious. I mean, they're a threat. Yes, anytime they're available, you get rid of them. But on the other hand, we do often see players get too focused on taking out one particular threat.
Mm-hmm.
While Gabler was saying, I'll let other people pick which threat they want, and then I'll shift accordingly. I think the main example he gave was that he personally wouldn't have targeted Noelle when they did, but he knew she was a threat. It had to go at some point. So, okay, I'll go along with it.
Right.
It really isn't much different from Anybody But Me in a situation
Mm-hmm.
where so many people were threats. It's like Anybody But Me and maybe those two over there.
Right.
You know, but I do have to acknowledge, he said in the preseason he would be playing like Sandra. We just thought that was very unlikely.
He did the Anybody But Me.
Yeah. Another specific example Gabler gave was in his plan to get to the end. He told Mike Bloom, I think if you have one way to go to the three, that's good. If you've got two ways, it's twice as good. If you've got three ways, it's three times as good. So I had multiple ways to get to three. If Cody would have played his idol and Carla would have gone home, I still could have gotten to final three. It just would have been a different final three. If
Right.
Cass would have gone home instead of Ryan, I still would have gotten to final three. I had multiple ways to three, and that's what I don't think was clearly shown in the edit. Now, on the flip side of this is that a major reason he had so many ways to get to the end was nobody was targeting him because he was one of the few people who the others didn't all consider to be a threat.
Right. He was the one everyone wanted in the final three with them.
Right.
So if you're that person, guess what? Every option is available to you.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to play the any threat but me game when nobody at any point is going to consider you to be among those threats.
Right. And I'm not trying to discount what he did. I mean, he certainly saw that he had paths to the end, but yes, if you were that person that everyone is like, oh, well, yeah, no, Gabler, like, yeah, no, we'll definitely bring Gabler because he's not a threat. We don't need to worry about him. Yeah, you're going to get to the final three under many paths, because you will be there regardless.
Yeah, and we'll obviously discuss that more in the sixth rule, but it goes back to the question of intention.
Yeah.
And whether he had cleverly masked his plans and threat level, or it kind of just happened because of who he was.
Yeah.
All right. So as we switch to Cassidy, what did you think about her for this rule?
Well, Cassidy was, I think, really great in this regard, just because whenever her name came up, she was able to shift the vote
Mm-hmm.
and have the focal point put on somebody else. And this is Cassidy's curse that we've already addressed. That so I feel like she was able to shift where she wanted to see the vote going, but at the same time, she wasn't shifting necessarily who she was working with in that core group, but she was looking outside of that core group when she needed to and bringing other people in, realizing that Gabler and Owen were individuals that she could work with too. So again, it's a little bit of a mix, but it's I think a more clear mix in regards to Cassidy, because she was willing to switch it up when she needed to, but also sticking with it because I mean, my gosh, she really hung in there with Carla, hoping
Right.
that she was going to be able to make it work with Carla, even though Carla was trying to get Cassidy voted out for
Yeah. I
quite
was
some
just gonna
time.
say Carla was not. Um,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, Carla or Cassidy practically quoted a different part of this rule in saying she had her finger on the pulse of the game.
Yes.
And we already discussed how, like you said, she was always in the know, always on the right side. Now, there were, of course, some people in the jury who said she wasn't always in the know because of that plan to oust her that didn't happen at the split tribal council.
Mm-hmm.
And others who I mentioned who suggested that just knowing about a plan didn't mean you were driving a plan.
That
It
sounds
was,
eerily like someone else.
yeah, it was strange that there were those criticisms of her, but
Mm-hmm.
not Gabler when he was admittedly floating from vote to vote.
Yeah.
But for some reason, the jury
Strange.
took that as a flexible strategy while they discounted what Cassidy did.
Yeah. Strange. Hmm.
Um, Now, Owen, of course, had the ultimate flexibility after the merge because, as he said at one point, he didn't care where he sat on the bus. He just wanted to be on it instead of running after it.
Oh my
Uh,
God, I forgot about that quote. I
yeah.
love that.
Yeah.
Poor guy.
Before then, he tried to be flexible as well, but, well, we've already discussed how the Baca dynamics didn't really give him much room to work.
I know.
Uh,
Owen,
yeah.
we wanted you to win.
Yes. Yes. Um, Hey,
We picked you.
we haven't mentioned it, but that's the closest our predictions have gotten in a while. So,
Well, yes, it has been really an exciting ride
yeah,
because we were concerned, and then he just stayed in and was
yes,
doing great, and I loved it. So thank you for that,
yes.
Owen.
But moving to Jesse, what are your thoughts about his flexibility?
Oh my gosh, so flexible. I mean, come on, he got rid of his ride or die, right? He knew exactly what he needed to do when he needed to do it. And again, we've already talked about his ability to work with whoever he was speaking to in such a way that really allowed him so many options, and he would come up with a master plan, and then that's what would happen. It
Mm-hmm.
was it was really quite incredible to watch his ability to do that. So I think his flexibility was off the charts in regards to his gameplay.
Yeah, he was clearly as flexible as he needed to. He started the game as the midpoint of his tribe with flexibility to go in either direction, and that continued throughout. He made so many allies, gained so much trust, and then voted them out one by one.
Yeah.
Um, Almost every week, we saw a plan, and then him considering other options, and then him changing the plan to better suit his needs,
Hmm.
and ending up, of course, with, like you said, voting out his tightest ally and best friend. He
Yeah.
gave himself choices and then did what he had to do.
Yeah.
Now, we've previously discussed that Carla played the pre merge game very similar to Jesse in that she was part of two different opposing alliances and could have gone either
Hmm.
way. And she was even more flexible in that she took out a member of the alliance she was staying with,
Right.
but pretended she was with the other one, and that made it better so that they could stick together.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think she certainly did a great job in considering her options and keeping her options open. And like we've discussed with the Lindsay vote, kind of being shocked that she was willing to take someone out from her alliance so soon, but she was keeping her options open clearly,
Mm-hmm.
as we learned from Geo that they were definitely much closer than we had known.
Yeah, yeah. Now, at the merge, we talked about how she also started working with other people like Jesse and Cody and Sammy while still keeping close to her original allies. She did give herself multiple ways to move forward and could talk her way into and out of different situations.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately for her, she ran into a couple of brick walls when James was voted out and then Jesse started gunning for her. Even when James was targeted, it did show how her flexibility had paid off because Sammy felt like he had to bring her in on the plan at the last minute.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there was very little she could do about it by that point, and because of the split tribal council format, and then it was kind of downhill from there.
Yeah. Pretty much.
So we can move on to the fourth rule, which tells players not to let their emotions control them. Now, I want to start by saying I think all of the final five did well here. Certainly, Jesse was shown as the epitome of this throughout the season and said multiple times they had relationships out there, but he had to set them aside and play the game. And noting that no relationship in the game was as important as playing for life-changing money for his family.
Yeah.
He voted out his island mom, Neka. He cried talking about the letter from home that Noelle enabled him to get and then voted her out. He became friends for life with Cody and blindsided the hell out of him, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely putting himself in front of all of that and not his emotions for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, like I said, Jesse was the main example, but I think all the others in the finale did similar things. Cassie voted out Lindsay, even though they'd become fast friends. Gabler was friends with pretty much everybody, but voted them out when their names came up. Owen was willing to vote out anyone just to get on that bus. And Karla certainly did not let emotional attachments get in the way of any of her votes either.
Yeah.
I don't know if you thought of anything different than that.
No, I do think that this is one of those situations where because we had so many duos, which we've talked about before, it's always interesting to see how that's going to shake out and how people are going to make decisions regarding their game when they've become so close with someone. And I think this is one of those seasons where we saw people continue to have a willingness to take out someone who was either in their alliance, someone that they'd forged a bond with of some sort, someone that they wanted to play the game with, but they were like, you know what, I have to make a game decision here and not an emotional one. And I do think that we definitely saw all five of these people do that impeccably well.
Okay. Well, speaking of five, let's move on to Rule 5, which tells players they need to pretend to be nice and play the social game. Now, this was the heart of Gabler's game. I mentioned in the first rule that he came in saying his strategy was to bond with and get to know his tribe mates. At Final Tribal Council, he emphasized that point. For example, responding to a question Jesse asked by saying he used his social game to get deeper and have more options.
Yeah.
Indeed, he told Dalton Ross that his game the entire time was a relationship game and said to Mike Bloom that he had relationships with everybody throughout the entire season. He added to Mike, I honestly got to know each person out there, and not in a devious way, like I'm going to get you later, but because I was like, I'm so grateful and blessed to be on the show with these amazing people. I want to get to know them. And by doing that, I've got lifelong friends. We all talk to each other. Even Ellie. I talked to Ellie for an hour yesterday. She's a great person. We have a great relationship. And while Ellie obviously wasn't on the jury, thanks to Gabler, his other relationships became abundantly clear when he was chatting up the jury in Final Tribal Council, and they were eating it up.
Oh, they were.
Some people have said he won them over by joking with them. I think it was the reverse. They were able to laugh along with him because he had previously won them over one way or another.
Yeah, and I will say that it's interesting that I don't know if we were provided that insight throughout the season.
Oh, God, no.
I feel like we were shown his attempt to have relationships with people and the response to them not being that jovial, like, oh, I love Gabler. He's such a great guy. It was always more of a, I don't really understand Gabler. I'm not really sure what's happening kind of thought process when you would hear people commenting on Gabler and that he's confused and I don't know which way he's voting, so I'm not really sure. And then we see the Gabler in Final Tribal, and people are just enamored and
Yeah.
laughing and really enjoying him, and they seem to understand him so much better than they understood him in the game, which I think is a huge disservice for us as viewers, because that's not what we saw. We didn't
Right.
see that funny, enjoyable Gabler. We saw people confused by the Gabler that we saw in the game.
Right. Yeah. And the thing is, Gabler was not always seen this way, even by his tribe mates. In the first rule, we talked about the early days of Baca and how he was, and that applies here too.
Mm-hmm.
As Sammy said, sometimes Gabler was not aware socially. We saw and laughed at him putting palm fronds on people who were sleeping.
Right.
But
the palm fronds.
Yes. But as we saw, and again, several people pointed this out on Twitter and elsewhere, and the more I thought about it, as the season went on, we saw less and less of those types of socially unaware moments from him. So what you said is true. What we saw was him being unaware, but those were from the early days. We didn't see much of that moving forward. They were still locked into our brains from then, which is one thing that I think colored our perceptions of him. So that when he said things to us, we laughed at them.
Right.
Like, no, you're not hiding in plain sight. No, you're not the alligabler.
Right.
We looked at those things and laughed because of our predisposition. But he had moved on. We didn't know he had moved on.
Right. Yeah.
And, but it does appear now that he learned and he stopped doing quite as many kooky things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So instead of doing kooky things, I think he did other things to help his social game. Now, again, part of the problem, as you mentioned, is we kept hearing about his relationships, but we didn't see them.
Right.
So just like we heard about him talking about his strategy, we didn't pay it much heed because we didn't think it was real.
Right.
But in his interviews, he talked about how he was trying to make new friends at the Mergatory, and James asked for his idol. So he loaned it to him as a sign of goodwill. And then a couple hours later, he had to come back and get it to show it to Janine so she wouldn't play hers to Ellie, or for Ellie. Now, I'm pretty sure James mentioned this in his interviews, and we were all like, what? But now it makes a little more sense. That kind of move can build social relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And he apparently had those in abundance, and he used them to move his game forward.
And also, weirdly enough, got Janine's vote in the end, too, despite the fact that he voted out or spearheaded the vote of Ellie, that Janine still saw something in Gabler that made her desirous of wanting to vote for him. So there must have been some type of a relationship or a bond there as well.
Right. Now, moving to Cassidy, it seemed like she had a lot of good social relationships, too. We heard people talk about her being good socially, and in interviews, the players mentioned her in positive ways. I think she was able to use those bonds to work with different people, make sure she was in the loop. She certainly knew about pretending to be nice, such as in episode 5 when she found out Gio had voted for her and told us, well, it's all about choosing her battles. And in that moment, she knew she had to play nice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that, Cassidy was also someone that certainly was able to create bonds with people. And I don't think she needed to pretend, because I do think that she was able to find people that
I think sometimes she had to pretend, like with Gio and Ryan.
Well, but this is what I'm saying. Like, so she,
Gio.
Yeah, so she could find those things that she needed to utilize relative to each person, form the close bonds that she needed to in order to play the game she wanted to play, but also not cause any waves when it was unnecessary, because she understood what those social relationships were relative to the game.
Yeah, and unfortunately, much like with Gable, we didn't see how she was doing with everyone. Like I said, we heard an interview.
We heard it, yeah,
but we didn't see it. And so it's like, come on.
Yeah.
Now we did see a time when she was not playing so nice when she was talking to Carla a few times in the past couple episodes. But she also knew that Carla was lying to her and even faking crying. You
Yeah.
know, that's certainly enough to make just about anyone upset.
Yeah.
In a perfect world, Cassidy should have found a way to not let on to Carla that she wasn't buying it and was upset with her. I think
Mm-hmm.
she was trying to. Judging by what we saw, she was trying to. Carla was just like, judging by her body language, I don't think so. And that's hard. When
Yeah.
someone is lying directly to your face, putting on fake tears, going through all this, it's hard to sit there and go, oh, yeah, I believe you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that is definitely a hard thing to do for sure. And knowing that you are hearing information from other people too that directly
Mm-hmm.
contradicts everything that Carla has just said to you. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's hard.
Yeah. Um, I do think, moving on, I think Owen also fell into the category of someone who's a really nice guy and didn't have to do a lot of pretending.
Right.
Which is good because also he sometimes became a curmudgeon and like threw things around. Uh, he actually reminds me of me when I was younger, and some might say still now. um,
Interesting. So you
yeah,
like chop up coconuts really aggressively and throw rocks into the ocean when you get angry?
not into the ocean. Let's just
Curmudgeon.
say it's
It's such a great word.
possible that I was having a discussion with someone at the oral surgeon's office who had screwed up, and I was keeping my voice at a reasonable level, and someone who was not involved in the discussion, who was a receptionist, said, "There's no reason to yell, sir." And I turned and I looked at her and said, "If I was yelling, you would know it."
Good to know.
Yeah, and then I played her the opening of last week's podcast. No.
Yeah, we know you can yell.
Yeah. I can get loud too,
That's right.
as a well-known survivor actually said. Um, anyway, enough about me. Probably too much about me. But
Mm-hmm.
I do think the other players mostly took the curmudgeon part in stride. As, for example, Gabler told Mike Bloom, Owen was a calming factor. I just like being around him. He's a cool guy.
Except when he's chopping
Except
coconuts very
when he was,
angrily.
yes. Or breaking parts of the Survivor Challenge, Yes.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah. Um, Now Owen clearly had a lot of friends on the jury. He often like would walk in and smile at them and they would smile back
Mm-hmm.
and we'd be like, "Oh, good for Owen." When he walked in with immunity at Final Five, they were literally saying, "Oh, good for him."
Yeah.
And while we already discussed how his game didn't measure up to what he thought it would be, I at least thought he might get a vote from someone like Noelle and maybe even Janine, but it
Right.
seems like Gabler managed to overshadow him even in this regard.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, moving on, we have the cult leader. And to be that kind of player,
It's amazing.
yeah, you need to be able to pretend to be nice and have a very good social game.
Right.
Other players indicated that Jesse was usually quieter, so he was certainly no Cody or Gabler. But we also know he gained people's friendships and trust in a way nobody else could do, a way we rarely see on these types of shows. He
Mm-hmm.
easily kept on a friendly face all the way up to the moment he cut you. Whether it was Justine, Dwight, Janine, Noelle, Cody, you name it. He could literally be sitting next to them, laughing with them, joking with them, knowing he was about to take them out.
Yeah. Very impressive. And impressive that people weren't upset with him about it either. That's like the
Yeah.
extra added component of it is, I mean, the jury was so sad when he
Oh, yeah.
was voted out, and then to hear them speak of Jesse while he
Mhm.
was sitting on the jury just told you everything you needed to know about how they perceived him and how they felt about him.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure Jesse was like, great, great. I'm still not getting the $1 million. Please give me the CO award. You know, I wanted, and I know this has nothing to do with it, but when Gabler said, "Well, I haven't told anybody this, but in the after show, I'm
Yeah.
giving the money all to charity." I wanted Jesse to stand up and be me, but not
You
that I'm
know,
saying Jesse is charity, but he
right.
wanted,
I'm so glad you brought that up too,
yeah,
because I mean, again, I'm not trying to take
yeah,
away from what Gabler wanted to do. I think
right,
that's incredible. But we heard Jesse so many times talking
hmm
about his family and what he
yeah,
wanted to be able to do for his family and crying and just and I like totally understand
right,
that because I had the same idea going
yeah,
in, like all of the things I'm going to be able to do for my family, and you want to help them, and
hmm
then Gabler's like, I'm going to donate all of that
yeah,
million, and Jesse's like, to my children,
yeah,
to me, like
yeah,
their college
yeah.
fund, maybe that's where it's gonna, yeah. So I mean,
Mhm.
like I
Let me
could
tell you about the Jesse's Kids College Fund.
see. It's gotta be like,
Yeah,
come on.
yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, who knows? Maybe he'll really start that cult and get Gabler as a member. Um,
He could.
yeah. Um, moving to Carla, she mostly followed this rule as well, and we already mentioned how she took pretending to another level by crying to Cassidy, and
Mm-hmm.
then she cried to the guys on reward, saying she didn't really have an idol. And it's so sad that people think that I have an idol, and it's so terrible. Um, you know, now she was convincing. The problem was Cassie didn't believe her and then had her suspicions immediately confirmed. And the guys believed her and then were immediately told that she was lying when Cassidy outed the idol.
Yeah.
So, of course, then Carla's discussion with Cassidy that we discussed earlier regarding her threat to poison the jury obviously was nowhere near pretending to be nice.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point for Carla, nice was out the window.
Yeah.
And it was all or nothing to survive. If she had managed to convince Cassidy to keep her with that threat, she obviously wasn't going to get Cassidy's vote to win at the end if Cassidy ended up in the jury. But in order to worry about that, Carla first had to make it that far. So that was
Yeah.
on her mind at the time.
Sure. Yeah.
So, all right. Well, the sixth rule warns against being too much of a threat, and that really defined the final five this season. Two big threats, three lower or perceived non threats, whether purposefully or by happenstance.
Yeah.
The two big threats were eliminated.
Mm-hmm.
Not a coincidence. It happened all season long. And really, it's been happening for a number of seasons in a row now. It is
Mm-hmm.
a recurring theme.
Yep.
Threats stick together for a while because it helps them. But then at some point, someone decides to poke their head up and say, it's time to take out the others. And
Mm-hmm.
once that happens, ding, 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 they all fall down like dominoes.
Yeah.
In this case, they were already falling going into Final Five. But then two of the game's biggest threats were still there, one of whom had just shown what a huge threat he was.
Yeah. And I think that this is the most difficult component of this game, right? Because it's so hard to have agency and to have these big moves and things on your resume that everyone expects you to have when you're actually sitting in the final three, but to still get to the final 3.
Mm-hmm.
It is a definitely difficult feat. And I do agree with you. It's one that we're seeing more and more often where those threats are being picked off at 8 and 7 and 6, and then we're left with people, and not to discount the 3 that were sitting there. I mean, people were talking about Cassidy as being a huge threat for quite some time throughout the game.
Until they suddenly weren't. Yeah.
Right, a different type of threat.
Yes.
She was an
Yeah.
an immunity type of
Mm-hmm.
threat. I mean, Owen was too. So it's like everybody's threat level is a little bit different. But as
Right.
far as the gameplay is concerned, I do think that it's interesting that we saw so many of the bigger threats get taken out before we get to the end, and so then we have a final 3 that isn't one of those big huge threats and isn't someone that everyone is like they're absolutely definitely going to win. You have a jury that comes in and says, well, I want to hear from everyone and I want to be
Right.
able to figure everything out. So it's a different type of game that is now being played for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even with the move that Jesse pulled off, people were still focused on Carla for that first vote.
Mm-hmm.
As Owen said, Jesse is a threat, but Carla, she can talk. He added, she's a huge threat. She's great at puzzles. She made moves. She could win the game. Jesse said in an interview that Carla most terrified him because she could match him strategically.
Mm.
Gabler said nobody wanted to sit next to Carla. Carla herself said earlier, I know I'm a freaking threat. I've won 2 immunity challenges. The rumor is that I have an idol because I actually do have an idol.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the vote against her was solidified when the other major threat pulled out Janine's idol.
Right. Yeah.
Now, moving into the final four, everybody knew what was going to happen next because nobody wanted to face Jesse at the end. As he said at the beginning of the finale, my threat level is probably off the charts. Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
On one of his survey scales of 1 to 10, it was a 15. And normally I hate people saying that, but it's true.
You're not
we
wrong.
we literally saw the jury saying at the Cody blindside, Jesse did it. Jesse did that shit. We
Yeah.
saw their mouths drop open and hang there forever when he pulled
Mm-hmm.
out Janine's idol.
Yeah.
Owen said Jesse was the mastermind behind the biggest move of the season and will get all the credit in the jury. And from everything we saw at the time since then, he was absolutely right. But Jesse had kept his threat level low all season long, in part by using Cody as that shield we mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And then he discarded the shield.
Yeah. And I feel like, this is an interesting part of this particular season as well. And it goes back to what Owen had said, that it was almost somewhat boring, is that, people didn't want to take those chances and
Mm-hmm.
make those big moves and have the light shining on them. And then because when it did, well, that's what happens. And you get
Mm-hmm.
voted out next because then everybody sees you. And Jesse is a perfect example of that. We were seeing Jesse and thinking, my gosh, he's such an incredible player and he's working all of these relationships. But it was a very quiet gameplay and it
Right.
wasn't something that everybody saw. But then as soon as they saw it, they were like, oh, wait a second. And it was like everything just came full circle and
Yeah.
people really started to realize the type of game that he had been playing the whole time. And it didn't really come to the forefront until it 100% absolutely did. And you had to
Right.
look at it and notice it. So,
Right.
yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating concept and something that, he managed for so long, but you can't manage it when you pull off a move like that. Like, I mean,
Right.
that's it.
And you
Like,
can't, with firemaking, you can't manage it all the way to the end. There's just no way. Well, you
are we
can,
going to talk about
but
Firemaking now?
oh no, not yet.
Okay.
Um, I've got an hour slated for that later. Um, just kidding. Maybe. But I mean, you can manage your threat level because with those two gone, it was a battle among the final three.
Well, sure.
You know, and we've already mentioned a couple times how Owen's game didn't go as he planned, meaning he was not viewed as a threat by just about anyone.
Mm-hmm.
He even told Gabler at one point that he should just take Owen to final three because he'd get no votes.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Unfortunately, he
yeah,
called that. Yeah.
Now Cassidy had done a more purposeful job of keeping her threat level low. From the beginning, she didn't want to be seen as a threat, and she knew she'd be left alone. As we previously discussed, she made lots of small moves, exactly the way we say a player should go through the game. She said in her global TV interview, I remember at Tribal Council, Jeff Probst would kind of push the agenda of big moves. She didn't say that. I wish she had. Well, I don't know. It was in print, but I would always say the big move is very often not the smart move.
Right.
She would often say that. We often say that.
That's right.
Well, come join us, Cassidy. Come join.
Right.
Well, you're already
Come on,
here.
Cassidy.
You're part of the cult already, apparently. This is not the Jesse cult. And well, maybe it is actually because he pretty much did the same thing. But so yeah, she's 100% right. And what's interesting is that attitude seemed to go along with the prevailing wisdom of the rest of the players this season, right up until final Tribal Council, when suddenly they wanted to hear about the big moves and the risk taking.
Right.
And that's like, wait, where'd that come from?
And honestly, and then you look at the list that is kind of being created that they're ticking off, and Gabler had the Ellie vote
Mm-hmm.
and Firemaking against Jesse. And then Cassidy, when she tried to reference all of
Mm-hmm.
the votes that she had been involved in, they were like, well, but you weren't the driving force to any of those decisions. And so too bad.
Yeah.
And then Owen was like, well, I don't really have any. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, we'll get to more of that.
yeah.
But but in kind of that same vein, one thing that's confusing is I mentioned that in episode 9, Jesse said Cassidy was super social, super strategic. But then oddly in episode 11, Jesse said Cassidy wasn't a huge threat, while
Yeah.
Cody worried about her as a challenge threat.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened between 9 and 11.
I don't know either.
I certainly don't know what happened between 9 and 11 in finale.
I would love some clarification.
Yeah.
Please.
So for Gabler, we already discussed in the first rule how he said his plan was to reduce his threat level after his high profile fight with Ellie, going underwater like the alligator. And while we laughed and joked about that when it happened, it does seem like that was his plan and it worked.
Yeah.
He kept talking about how nobody was targeting him. He didn't get any votes. Now, Cassidy asked him very nicely, I thought, in Final Tribal Council, the question that I'm sure many of us were wondering, do you think maybe you didn't get any votes because the others didn't see you as a threat? And he said, yeah, if I stayed up top, it wouldn't have lasted. And I would say it's probably true.
Yeah, and here's the thing. I appreciate the fact that Cassidy brought that up, but I also feel like, in just my humble opinion, if it matters, that it might have been better
It
to have
matters. You
good,
matter.
good. I don't think I would have posed that as a question to him. I think I would have done it more as a statement to the jury to allow them an opportunity to think about it, as opposed to give him an opportunity to justify it.
I understand what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Under normal circumstances, I agree. I think that was deep enough into the process that she saw whatever she said, the jury went la 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 la.
Yeah, and that's
So
fair. That
by
is fair.
posing it as a question to him, it made him answer and maybe mess up.
Yeah, he had to acknowledge it. Yeah.
Right.
So that makes sense.
So yeah, so if that's the reason she did it that way, that was astute on her part.
Right. Yeah.
Um
Yeah, and something else that we've also already talked about in regards to Gabler is everyone wanted to bring Gabler to the
right.
end with them. So clearly that tells you something about his threat level, that they didn't deem him as a threat. Right.
Right.
And so, yeah, he did exactly what he set out to do. He wanted to manage his threat level and wanted to keep it minimal, which he did.
Yeah. A few other jurors commented on him lowering his threat level. Noelle said he did a good job keeping her comfortable when they were about to vote her out. Jesse noted that Gabler said they were playing the silent killers, taking people out. And they indeed were, because remember that at that time when they were talking, Jesse was also hiding his threat level. So Jesse credited him with having both the intention of reducing his threat level and carrying it out.
Right. Yeah.
So, even the CBS social media had his quote about, you don't bring an axe to the front door, you use a vial of poison. It's just that the CBS social media person doesn't know how to spell vial. So, yeah, yes. Use a dictionary. Also use a grammar book because you missed an apostrophe too.
Damn it.
So,
come on.
Yeah. But anyway, this brings us back. Not that doesn't bring us back, but this whole issue brings us back to the question of why Cassidy keeping her threat level low wasn't applauded, but Gabler doing so was.
Yeah.
I think that mostly speaks to the overall thoughts of the jurors, which we've hit on some already, and we'll definitely get to in a little while in Appendix B.
Yeah.
But first, we have the 7th rule, which covers idols and advantages and game mechanics and stuff like that. Of course, we know that Gabler got his two tribal council idol early on, let everybody know about it through his howl. He didn't need to use it the first tribal council thanks in part to Ellie and in part to him saying he wasn't going to use it because vote him out. Um, but then she turned around and tried to gaslight him into believing it wasn't good anymore.
Right.
He wasn't falling for it. Then at his second tribal council, he was in the safe group anyway, so it didn't matter.
Right.
Cassidy didn't have an idol of her own, but she figured out that Karla had one and then got confirmation of it. She held on to that secret until Karla forced the self-fulfilling prophecy of
Thank you for
Cassidy.
saying that.
Yeah, of Cassidy telling others about it because she turned on Cassidy because she thought Cassidy would tell others about it.
Right. Self-fulfilling prophecy all day long. Yes.
Yeah. Owen shared the journey to Advantage Island with Noelle and along with James, let her get the steal a vote, then worked with her to have her steal his vote. But that journey also led to them working together once the merge hit, sharing information such that Owen was able to piece together most of the rest of what people had in a nifty little screen graphic. The only people he missed was Karla and Cody having idols.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've already referenced Karla's idol a couple times. Her original find of it was interesting because she saw it, she left it, and on Twitter, when we're live tweeting, we're like, yay, someone left behind the Beware Advantage. And then she changed her mind and went back to get it. We were like, ah.
Yeah.
And then she wheeled and dealed and got the beads, and we were like, yay. And then people found out the beads at the merge, and we wondered what would happen. Yet somehow it seemed like it stayed secret.
Right.
Until out of the blue, Jesse was like, oh, yeah, I know about it. And so do other people. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
And then suddenly Cassie knew about it and had for a while. And we're like, wait, what?
Yeah. All of this would have been nice to know.
Right. And then, of course, self-fulfilling prophecy. Cassie told the others. Jesse flushed it out. There were a lot of ups and downs associated with that idol.
Yeah. No, there definitely were. And I feel like the structure of the idols this season, well, they tried to make it different, was not great.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The question has come up as to whether Karla should have just left the Beware Advantage originally. It came up on the after show as Janine said it was better to be the friend of the person who got the idol rather than the person who found it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it just seems like these days it is too easy for others to figure it out and target you.
Yeah.
You know, there are certainly times when it would be good to take the risk. Like you're in immediate danger.
Right.
Okay, take the risk.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't what was happening here.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the times it would be better to pass it up.
Yeah.
I just know it's unrealistic. People see advantage and they're like, oh, must have.
Well, and I'm curious too. It almost seems like it's counterproductive for Survivor CBS to be approaching the game in the way that they are, considering how it's now being played, because people are unwilling to make those big moves because when they do, then they get voted out almost immediately, right? There's this concern that we've already talked about, that it's almost better to play a boring game or under the radar or not be flashy.
It always has been, and this has always been something that sorry, I interrupt your train of thought.
That's
there, but
right.
It's always been something that we've talked about, that going all the way back to like Ghost Island, or I mean that's not all the way back, it's not that far, but going back, playing a boring game is often can lead to playing a winning game.
Oh, for sure. But the problem now, if you are desirous of doing that, then you have production throwing these things at the players and kind of forcing their hand in a way that didn't exist. I mean, when idols first were introduced to the game, you had to go out actively looking for them. And sometimes you didn't have a clue. Maybe there would be a clue, but you really had to be, you had to make a decision. I am going to do this right now. Whereas now they're like dropping them in in front of the camp, basically in the water well, and they're like, I'm going to tease you big time right now, and I'm going to force you to make a decision you might not want to make. And when you are playing the game and when your head is in that space, you have that immediate response like, I better do this, even though long-term thinking, it's not the best thing for you. And unfortunately, with now the idols including this beware component, you're losing something, as opposed to in prior seasons of Survivor where you found an idol and you're like, great, I can use it or not. Now it's like, oh, here's this thing, and also we're taking away your vote. Aha. It's
a
like,
more dangerous game.
to me, I just feel like it's become too much in trying to force a player's hand to do something,
Well,
instead of allowing the player to work through it themselves.
yeah, and it reminds me of something that Taron Armstrong has talked about with Big Brother. Big Brother likes to try to push twists because someone at Big Brother believes, oh, this will spice things up. This will make it so that one big alliance doesn't dominate, which happens a lot more often in Big Brother than Survivor. But what usually happens is people see twists and they, oh no, we have to contract into our bubble and play even more conservatively so the twist doesn't affect us. That's starting to happen somewhat in Survivor.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's that people are now almost afraid to actually do those things because they're realizing what comes with these advantages. What knowledge is power.
Oh God.
The players, they don't speak well of it when they're out there. Nobody wants it, and Survivor keeps throwing it at them, hoping that they can make it stick.
Literally keeps throwing it at them 3 times.
Yes. Yeah.
Come on. So yeah.
Is this what we're going to talk about, Firemaking?
No, not yet. Oh God, we've got at least 5-10 minutes. But we're still in Rule 7. So to get back to just to round out with Jesse, he of course didn't find any idols himself, but he did make good use of the ones he got from other people.
My word, yes.
Yeah. In both the cases of Cody's and Janine's via Dwight, it was the level of trust people had in him that enabled him to get those. So it really takes us back to our previous discussions. Other cult leaders get people to give them their money. Jesse got him to give them their idol beads.
Well, and I will say that this is something that I find fascinating, just again, because you have the effect of the game and I'm so sorry if you hear all of this coming from upstairs.
Some dogs.
My dogs are losing their mind a little bit upstairs. But the fact that you have these advantages that are affecting people's willingness to even hold on to their own idols now, because they're so afraid of someone having an advantage that could potentially steal their idol, then they're passing it off to someone who then does what? Uses it to get them voted out.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. What I worry about is, I think we talked about this, Jeff Probst is high-fiving. Like, woohoo! Yes. We made a moment. And so, yeah. But the thing is, that wasn't Jesse's only interaction with idols. As we discussed last week, Jesse was the brains of the operation, telling Cody to use his hat as an excuse to get the beads. And of course, he used the idols to put on those couple shows, like we said. So yeah, he was making the most, even though he didn't get anything himself, he made the most of it.
Yeah, no, he absolutely did, for sure.
All right. Well, that rounds out the rules. Time for the appendices. We'll start with Appendix A. This is going to be quick because it's about the players keeping their end goals in mind when voting. And we talk about voting out the weak, then the strong, then the weak, then the strong. I'm going to be real quick and say, I think everybody did exactly what they should have done in this boot order.
Yeah.
I predicted that Jesse would use his idol to ensure Carla left in 5th place. Wasn't that hard a prediction. I mean, it was the last time he could use his idol. And, but the reason, of course, we're targeting Carla, she was one of the strongest opponents left, as we've discussed. Moving to Final Four, it was clear to everyone that Jesse needed to be targeted in Firemaking because he was one of the strongest opponents left. Cassidy knew she had to put the best Firemaker against him to have the greatest chance of getting him out. Boom. Each of the final three believed their best chances were against the other members of the final three. As we all heard them say, they had made plans to get to the end this way.
Right.
They were their own best opponents.
Yes.
And so everybody, I was just going to round it out and say, so yes, everybody voted to keep their end goals in mind here.
Yes. And unfortunately, Cassidy's decision worked against her instead of for her as a move.
Oh,
Crazy.
We'll get to that in a second here.
Mm-hmm. I just want to get there already.
Oh, yeah, I know. We're building up to it. There, you could say the fire is smoldering. So Appendix B covers the jury phase of the game, and look at where we are.
Fascinating.
Yes. There has been a lot of debate already about the jury. I think part of the issue is we've really only heard from the last two jurors in interviews, but we've also heard contradicting things both on the show and in those interviews.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to get some of those out of the way before we get to more specifics of what happened in the jury, even though there's overlap. Now, one of the things we heard on the show was that the jury created a checklist for each of the final three, and whoever checked the most boxes was going to win. The jurors all knew what they wanted to hear from everybody. But it sure seemed like that checklist, they were graded on a curve.
Yeah.
Like Gabler had to explain his game, while Cassidy had to recite the first 50 digits of pi, while Owen had to explain statistical thermodynamics. Which, by the way, statistical thermodynamics was a graduate level class I took twice and still never got above a 19% on any test.
Did you say 19?
19, yes. Yeah.
Out of 100?
Yes.
Okay.
And that was just from partial credit, like throwing equations down and hoping.
Just want to make sure we're all on the same page here.
Yes, that's what I'm saying they needed out of Owen.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's fine in a way because you should have differing opinions of each finalist by that point.
Sure.
You shouldn't just judge a whole game based on the last 3 hours. But then please don't tell us that the jury came in fully open to any of them winning.
Yeah.
And especially don't contradict us, or don't tell us that and then contradict it by saying, whoever beat Jesse and Fire was probably going to win the game anyway, because Firemaking obviously came before the final tribal council.
Thank you.
Not getting there yet, but
come on.
Up, still smoldering, still smoking. We used to get full jury speaks videos on Paramount Plus or CBS All Access, whatever.
Yeah.
So we could get a true feel for what each juror was thinking ahead of time, but they don't do those anymore. And now they just give us little teeny tiny and frankly unenlightening snippets on the show.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's definitely incredibly frustrating that we find ourselves looking at a final three and there are similarities between the games relative to especially the winner and the second place individual. And one gets credit for completing these things and the other does not. And you have to wonder why that is. And I know that a lot of people are wondering why that is. And we're trying to explain it, but we're limited in the information that we have because, as you've said, we only have interviews from two jurors. And I am very curious to know what additional conversations there were. Because if you have a checklist, and if people are checking things off of that list, well, then someone's list must have more checklists or checks than the other person.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. You know, the jury made it clear. They wanted to hear certain things, even though, like I said, it looked like their minds were mostly made up.
Yes.
But either way, that's their right as jurors.
Sure.
Okay. But I do think you should be open beyond the checklist. Don't give someone a test and then refuse to give them credit for a right answer just because you don't like how they got to that answer.
And also, if your checklist is skewed, then your checklist is not necessarily fair, right?
Yeah.
Because you can, if you're creating a checklist, you can skew it in any fashion that you like, or you can try to manipulate it to include
Mhm.
certain things that shouldn't necessarily be included because you want to give somebody credit for something that they did. Because what did we talk about? Your perception
Right.
and what you feel about a certain person's game can certainly skew that checklist and what you
Yes.
want to have on it and what your thoughts are relative to how significant is that particular check next to whatever it is we've determined to be of significance.
Right. All right. Now the moment you've been waiting for.
Fire.
Fire. Fire. Um,
Listen,
let's talk about that. I
let's
know.
kvetch.
Oh, it's not kvetching. It's truth time. Um,
Love it.
now I know just about every podcaster and writer and many former players on social media have come out and said basing your decision on firemaking is terrible.
Yes,
I go further. It's ridiculous. It's preposterous. It's offensive.
it is offensive.
This is a 26-day game of social politics, scheming, strategy, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the players in that jury did amazing jobs in those areas.
Yes.
And then they're going to throw that away because someone set fire to some sticks quickly.
Yes.
How would they have felt if the same had been done to them?
Yeah.
Like, I know that you led every vote. I know that you did it, but that person, started a fire.
Yeah.
I bet they'd be pretty pissed.
I think so. And they're also going to discount the fact that that final immunity challenge, which used to be the most significant immunity challenge to win, what is it everyone is trying to do when they're playing the game of Survivor? What are they
Be
trying to do?
immune.
Right. I want to win immunity because
Mhm.
why? Because it gives you power. It gives you an opportunity to not be voted out. And you kind of lead the charge in a way. Everybody comes to you because you're the person who can't be voted out. All of that is the goal when you're playing Survivor. It's not making a damn fire. That's never the goal. Jeff isn't bringing everybody in to go, okay, and today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be making fire. And like, that's not what the competition is about. And so the fact that you are going to discredit someone for winning the most significant immunity challenge,
Mhm.
which was probably the most pressure she was ever going to feel, suddenly that doesn't matter anymore because then it turns into a skill set as opposed to having to compete in
Mhm.
a very difficult challenge against the wind and against the elements to now let's see what you've learned about survival skills. Or maybe you just come in having survival skills already because you do
Right.
it every day in your
Right.
life that you're living. It's insane. It's utterly ridiculous. There was a time that firemaking was a tiebreaker. That's
Mhm.
what firemaking was. And that's what firemaking should become again.
Yes. Yeah. And what's even worse is some of them calling firemaking a move.
Oh my
Noel's
gosh.
Noel's question in jury asking why Cassidy didn't take on the so-called big move of taking out Jesse and firemaking. It pissed me off. And
It's terrible.
apparently
It's
it
terrible.
pissed off a lot of other people too. Because I
Underwood has
tweeted,
become a verb. Do you understand
yeah,
this?
yeah, I tweeted, live tweeting, saying Cassidy standing up for herself against the question of why she didn't put herself in firemaking, a question that should never even be asked, incidentally.
Mm-hmm.
That is my most popular tweet ever
Mm-hmm.
by like a lot. Like it has almost doubled my next most popular tweet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's still going.
Mm-hmm.
It was a live tweet in the middle of a whole bunch of others, and it's still going.
Yeah.
As Cassidy said, she'd played a good game. She'd worked her ass off. She won that immunity.
Yeah.
She deserved to be there.
Right.
Jesse said 2 days earlier he learned not to give up immunity. Then he turned around and criticized her for not doing the same thing.
Right. Yeah.
You know?
Here's the thing. Her move should have been her decision of
Yes.
who she's putting up against Jesse, because that's the person that everyone
That
is expecting to sit in the final three and win.
Yes.
That's the guy you got to get out.
That's the move.
Right.
But I do want to say, don't get me wrong, Jesse trying to convince her while he was in the game was again the right move. Just
Oh,
like
sure.
just like Carla threatening,
Hmm.
because he acknowledged she would be the easiest for him to beat.
Right.
Him holding it against her afterwards
Yeah.
was not.
No.
I get the emotion of it. A day
Hmm.
after he was knocked out, he didn't want to go out and fire. He was upset. But the same cannot be said for everyone else. He told Mike Bloom that the way the jury was thinking, it was like whoever takes me out is probably going to be the person that wins the game.
Hmm.
Similarly, Carla said her vote was based on who made moves and who fought to get Jesse out, and she credited Gabler with that. But again, you were just saying it. Winning a fire competition is not a move.
No.
Credit to Gabler for beating the record. Great.
Sure.
Good job. He
Congrats.
was fighting to stay in the game
Right.
because he'd been put into that position.
Right.
He didn't knock Jesse out. He kept himself in.
Yes.
Cassidy knocked Jesse out by thinking about the best way to proceed,
Hmm.
putting them both in that position.
Yes.
Good players know you don't need to do every little thing yourself.
Hmm.
You manipulate other people to do it.
Right.
It, quite frankly, makes me mad that people who played a whole game of Survivor, the actual game of Survivor,
Yeah.
and did a good job, and who I liked, went and voted, apparently in large part based on who made a stupid fire.
Right. And you are taking away the power that has been given to that person from that final immunity, because that was the immunity that everyone was, as someone who's watching the show, you're like, oh my gosh, is this person really going to win? And it brought me back to Jenna. It was a Marquesas, if I'm saying when it was down like the final four, and Rob, she ended up winning that final immunity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how he ended up getting taken out of the game, if I'm kind of like putting all the pieces
Are you talking
together.
about Amazon?
It was at Amazon. I can't, but I just
Yeah.
know. Okay, so Amazon. So
Yeah.
but it was one of those situations where, like, as a viewer, you're like, oh my gosh, this is happening. Like, someone who no one wanted to win that final immunity just won. And that person now has all of the power to make this decision. And how many times have we seen that decision then end up being the wrong decision made by the person who won? I mean, when you're choosing who you're taking with you to the final three or the final two, when it used
You
to be a
mean
final
like
two,
a certain Woo?
certain Woo, how about a Cody? I mean, when
Right.
you're like, you're choosing that person you're going to sit next to because you believe you can beat that person.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's like, guess what? That doesn't matter anymore. Too bad, so sad, because now it's going to come down to a goddamn fire making challenge instead.
Yeah. Yeah. The game is about outwit, outplay, outlast.
Yes.
Outflame does not appear in there anywhere.
Nope.
And the other thing is, Jeff himself said at least twice before and after Final Immunity Challenge that winning it put that person into Final 3.
Yeah.
She was already there.
Yeah. Yeah. Why does she have to win it?
Yeah.
She already
Several
did win it.
people have pointed out that for years, poor Eric Reichenbach has been ridiculed by some, including Jeff himself, for giving away immunity for what he thought was a strategic plan and getting voted out.
Yeah.
But apparently that's what this jury would have wanted to see.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
horrifying.
I mean, my son, who is a much newer watcher of it, he didn't even know you could do that. He was texting me. He's like, you can give away immunity? Why would anyone do that?
Right. Because apparently that's what the jury's expected to do now.
Yeah.
And someone actually brought up a very interesting point in one of the many things I was reading.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that, so essentially with this argument, if Owen had been the one that had been put against Jesse, which I believe in my vision I saw happening in order to get Owen to win, that's how he was going to take Jesse out, that would have allowed then Owen to win over Cassidy, because he would have taken out Jesse, because apparently that was the only thing that really mattered, was whoever was going to take out Jesse in Firemaking was then going to win final tribal, or the game overall in that final tribal council, because your answers don't matter. Why are you even answering questions? It doesn't matter, because we just saw Gabler make fire faster than Jesse and put Jesse over here on the jury, and we all think Jesse should have won. So I guess now Gabler wins. Like, why do we have to ask any questions at that point?
Yeah, why have a final tribal council?
Right, like we're done. It's
Yeah.
oh yay.
Yeah.
What are we doing?
Yeah, at that point, you're better off not winning final immunity.
Oh, and that's the other part of this is so like the way that the game is being structured, you are taking players' desire to want to win away from them. And this is something that we've talked about in that decision-making process. When you are the person who has won, and now you have to decide who to sit next to and who to make fire, there was that automatic, like, whoever you choose to sit next to you is then deemed insignificant and not a threat, because you're saying that I'm pretty sure I can beat this person, so I'm going to choose to put them next to me. And so you've then given that person a lower bar, right? Like all of a sudden the jury's like, okay, that person's insignificant. So the person that really matters is the one that you put over here. Who are you actually putting in that fire making challenge? Those are the ones we have to look out for. And so instead of the dynamic being this person that won immunity is the one that's in control, it's this whole shift of power, because now you're seeing people for different reasons. And it's just unfair overall, because as you said, outwit, outplay, outlast. That's what it is. And now this has turned into some strange structure that takes what should be the final immunity component and elevate it as it always has been, and just taking that completely away from them. Because why do you want to win? You don't want to at that point.
It's like taking a marathon, 26 miles, conveniently 26 days. And instead of making them run the whole marathon, or they run the whole marathon up to the last 20 yards, and then they stop everyone, say, okay, everyone catch your breath. Now run to the finish. It's actually a sprint. Ha. Never mind. We didn't really mean for you to run the rest of it. It didn't matter.
Yeah. I can't. I just can't. I mean, and here's what Gabler made a really quick fire. Awesome. Yeah, that's the talented skill. And he managed to hide that from them the entire 26 days, wasn't making fire as he should, which is also quite silly, because let's think about this. Okay. Fire is life, right? This is what Jeff says all the time. And once your fire is gone, so are you, kind of thing. You have to make fire when you're playing this game, because if you don't make fire, you're not going to eat. You're not going to be warm. Like, the fire becomes a very significant part of just survival in general. And now you're like instilling in players a fear of making fire in order to play this game, because they don't want to be seen as being good at making fire.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yes.
It's terrible.
Yes. Deep breath. Because with all of that said, we still need to discuss more of what actually happened in Final Tribal Council. And
okay, I'm sorry.
No, not you. It was a joint rant. And we have to look into the jury's minds beyond just the firemaking. Now, as I mentioned, I think the checklists coming in were very different, even if we ignore firemaking. Rob mentioned, I think, in know-it-alls, and I was having similar conversations on Twitter at the same time, that Gabler more played to what the jury already thought of him, while Cassidy did not. And, this goes back to what I said about putting players in a box with the checklists. Like, here's where I think Gabler is. Here's where I think Cassidy. Oh, wait, Cassidy says she's outside the box. Oh, she must be wrong.
Right.
And then Owen acknowledged in interviews he had fewer boxes to check. He said he presented it in the best way he could, and he's probably right. I do think he could have been a little less self-deprecating, tried to take a little more credit. But I feel like the jury would have looked at him and been like, what are you talking about? You're Charlie Brown. Now you suddenly want to tell us you're Superman?
Yeah. No, I agree with that sentiment. And I also think that there's an interesting little side here as well, as far as their explanations of themselves that we did see kind of coming across, which there was a conversation between Gabler and Cassidy and Owen during their breakfast where Gabler actually identified each of the three of them, and I believe he called Cassidy the competitor. I think that's
Right.
what he said about her. And then he was like, "I'm the outsider, and Owen is the underdog." And if he did that to try to create some narrative in their own minds about how they were going to be perceived, that's interesting that he would have planted that seed, because we actually heard them all refer to, like, I think Cassidy called Gabler the outsider, and
Mm-hmm.
actually, and Owen referred to himself as the underdog. And so it's interesting that we saw those same
Yeah, I don't know
words
that
being
he was.
used.
I don't think he was the first one to come up with it. I think he was just summarizing it.
And that's, and so I guess my point would be, if that is how you are perceived,
Mm-hmm.
and if you know that to be the perception of you, I do agree with Owen, even though the self-deprecating was a bit too much. What else are you supposed to do at that
Right.
point? Because
Yeah.
perception is reality. And so
Yes.
if this is how people are perceiving you, you do have to kind of play that up, but you also have to spin it in a way that makes it part of your game, and that makes you desirous of the win
Mm-hmm.
based upon what you did, even despite the fact that you're the
Right.
underdog, or
Right.
that you are the outsider, and things of that nature. So yes, you have to be very aware of how the jury is seeing you and how you are answering those questions, for sure.
Yeah. Now within those checklists, Gabler did a great job of telling the jury what they wanted to hear. They needed him to tell them he wasn't the kooky old guy. And he
Mm,
did that. He talked about all the relationships he established. He described how he used those to form different alliances and weave in and out of them and give himself flexibility. He covered at length how he had made the Ellie move and then gone underwater like the alligator, which they all love.
mm-hmm.
All the things that we've discussed here already. Cassidy explained her game too, noting she was on the right side of every vote. She was in the trenches, making sure the vote went the way she wanted. When someone brought her up, she put them in the crosshairs, etc. But as we've mentioned, the jury didn't want to accept her
Mm-mm.
arguments for whatever reasons. She said in interviews that it was like they were already closed off to her. And that's the way it seemed to me, at least in watching. She gave them perhaps what they expected to hear, but not what they wanted to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And as this appendix says, and also Rob mentioned in one of his podcasts, you need to figure out what the jury wants to hear,
Yes.
even if that doesn't align with what you want to tell them.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's hard, especially if they want to hear you say things that don't make sense. If they truly came in open-minded and not already convinced by firemaking or something else, there must have been something they wanted. I just don't know what.
Yeah, because even Cassidy tried to, like, apologize to Carla, and then
Right,
Carla said, "Oh, I think she was just trying to get my vote."
right.
Well, what is she supposed to do at that point?
Yeah.
I mean,
Tell you,
she
well,
even said, "I'm not
yeah,
pandering to you.
I
Like,
mean, yeah,
do you want her to sit there and go, ha ha, I'm so, I
yeah,
got one over on you."
right,
I
right.
don't, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Um, and so she was going through this, and Gabler just had them eating out of the palm of his hands.
Yeah.
As Marianne noted in the recap podcast, he admitted his early mistakes. He explained what he had done afterwards, and clearly that was what the jury wanted out of him.
Yeah, and I do think that, that self-fulfilling prophecy is an interesting concept that you brought up earlier, and we can kind of look at it here. Is that when you're going into final tribal council, you do have expectations of the people, because you know the
Mm-hmm.
game that they've played. And they can exceed those expectations, or they can fall right into them. And if the perception that you have of this person is what that person then presents, then you're going to say, "Oh, okay, you just affirmed everything I thought in my
Mm-hmm.
mind, and therefore I'm going to stick with my initial idea of who this person I want as the winner should be." And so it becomes a very skewed thing that is happening, because you've had maybe limited interactions with someone who's sitting there in the final three, and yet you are making this determination and having to compare games, and you might not know all of the game that this person has played, so you're relying upon the people on the
Mm-hmm.
jury to affirm certain things, or to talk to you about certain components of people's games. And so it is a very difficult thing that happens. And this is why, and I'm kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but this is why
What? You never.
I know what happens in tribal council becomes so much more significant to the jury because they
Mhm.
see it for themselves,
Right.
which is why fire has become so significant because they get to
Mhm.
see it, they get to
Mhm.
watch it, it's entertaining. And this is why I go back to that idea that if people are at Ponderosa, I think they should be allowed to watch live feeds of what's happening on the island and the actual challenges themselves because they're going to see it for themselves as opposed to
Mhm.
hearing it from other players or then having to hear it in tribal council.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I understand what you're saying. It'll never happen, but
Oh,
I
I know,
understand what you're
but
saying.
but
Yeah.
this is the issue that we find ourselves is that
Right.
you can only explain so much of your game,
Right.
and if they're not seeing it, they don't know it. And
Yeah.
if you don't have anyone on the jury cheerleading for you or saying, "Yeah, that's what happened,"
Mhm.
then it's like it never happened,
I
right?
mean, just
Which is
imagine the Noelle one where she had to work over that balance beam. Okay.
mhm.
And then it takes her forever. It took her like a half hour or something like that to make it over that balance beam. And then she comes back and wins that reward challenge.
Mhm.
You can't explain that in words that do any justice
Right.
to actually seeing it.
Right. Exactly. And this is why there are certain things that the jury will never be able to fully comprehend
Right.
if they haven't seen it for themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I mean, and that also goes to moves. And then it comes to perception. So we saw
Mhm.
in one case, Cassidy was asked about a move she specifically made, and she talked about the Ryan vote, but she got fact checked,
Yeah.
which had to be rough for her. But she said in interviews that she then brought up another one. She was like, okay, you're going to knock me down on that one. What about this one? I convinced Cody to vote Noelle out, and Cody agreed with that one. Okay. But didn't seem to matter a whole lot.
Right.
And she acknowledged in interviews that as players, they don't always know what's going on behind the scenes.
Mhm.
But it just seemed like Gabler was getting credited for not getting targeted while she was getting blamed for getting targeted and surviving, taking
Yeah.
affirmative actions to survive.
Mhm. Yeah.
I do think Rob hit the nail on the head for at least part of this when he said on Know It Alls that one problem with the position Cassidy was in was trying to claim credit for her own moves in a way took away credit from some of the people on the jury who thought they were totally in control. I think you referenced this earlier too.
Yeah.
It's been so long ago that I can't remember for sure. Um, but when she said she was making those moves with Carla, I think in Carla's mind, it took away from some of what Carla did.
Right.
When she said she was saving herself, it took away from Jesse. And he said, no, I was the one who saved you.
Yeah.
Now, it could be that all of these things were true,
Mhm.
but from their own perspective, they were the ones doing it, not her. She wasn't trying to claim individual credit. She was saying we worked together. But they
Right.
were like, no, it was me.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Gabler discussed what he did in a way that allowed them to keep the credit. So he didn't upset anyone.
Mhm.
And I feel like Gabler did do a better job of making the jurors feel good. Like he helped them.
Yes.
And, Cassidy had the nerve to say she helped herself.
Yeah, and I think too that it's one of these approaches where Gabler has all of the
Mhm.
Baca boys, the Coco,
Right.
whatever, the ride or die. Like, so you familiarize it for the people sitting there, and you make people desirous of wanting to be part of that thing
Yes.
because it isn't just about Gabler. It's about these other people that exist with me. And so it's almost like Gabler is reaffirming the game that they played
Right.
and like, hey, we did this together. And he 100% was credited for that, even though he wasn't spearheading any of it,
Right.
which is what was one of the questions. Like, what was a move that you actually did yourself? And
Mhm.
so and I think that Cassidy's explanation of that, it didn't make the people who were with her want to feel that way. And I don't know if it was just because she didn't have fun names. There was no Baka Boys or Coco whatever, or, Ride or
She
Dies for
wasn't the
her.
Allie Cassidy, you know,
Yeah, like there wasn't any fun names to throw
yeah.
out there. And so it definitely has a different effect on the people who are hearing it, because you don't have that affirmation coming from the people who are in that group with her.
Yeah. And I also think, and I've been trying to think about this as we've been going along. I can't remember if this was on a podcast that we did or a podcast I heard. But some players, if they're working with someone and they get knocked out, but that someone is in the finals, some people take that as a compliment. Like, I'm going to vote
Yes.
for you because
Yes.
I see me in you.
Yes.
I feel like it was a podcast we did with Adam. I don't know why. I don't know if that's 100% true. That's what I feel.
But that is 100% true. And that's the affirmation that you want.
Right.
And that's what Jesse was doing. And that's what Cody was doing.
Right.
They were making Gabler feel good. And by doing that, making the jury feel good about Gabler, because they were affirming what he was saying.
Right.
And you didn't have anyone doing that for Cassidy. And I feel
Right.
like instead of saying, yeah, Cassidy, I helped you get in that seat because you and I work together, and because you're sitting there, my game is being credited too, because I helped get you there because we were playing such a similar game. Like that could have been utilized as an affirmation of their own game, but that's not what happened.
No,
And
exactly.
and it's just unfortunate that the group that you're with and how they choose to present you to the jury on their own is really, it's up to the jury. Obviously they can do with that information whatever they want, but it's unfortunate that you had some really big like hoorahs for Gabler and crickets happening for Cassidy when they had done very similar things in
Yes.
certain parts of the game.
Yeah, and another thing that was used as a strike against Cassie was that she didn't make any big flashy moves. Now, we could see that because of what I mentioned earlier in the podcast about them asking for one specific thing that she did, which, as I noted, was a flawed question. The thing is, and this was something you brought up way at the beginning of the podcast, they had to go all the way back to the merge to dig up Gabler's big move of voting out Ellie. And of course, Firemaking, which isn't a move anyway. Right. So another situation where it seemed like they were just looking for reasons to credit Gabler, but not Cassidy.
Yeah.
Except, of course, for James, who noted in his vote that she stood up for her game and explained it.
Yeah.
And James was the closest to her and therefore best understood her game.
Yeah. It's crazy. Crazy how that works.
Now, overall, I do think Gabler had a better final tribal council performance. As Cassie said in interviews, one of her mistakes was underestimating him and how much people liked him.
Right.
Gabler said he's a better orator than he got credit for. So a lot of the game, people underestimated him. He even told us early in the game that he could downplay himself, and he did. Either Gabler really did plan out and did all those things, or he did an amazing job of claiming them all in a way that was certainly convincing. And then he continued into interviews. I think he really did them and had everybody fooled. As Rob noted in one podcast, at first Gabler was very unself-aware, but then he became self-aware, and he used that. But it still does leave us with the question that you're bringing up. Why was Gabler's game of lying low credited, but Cassidy's was not? Part of it was likely what we already discussed about how it was presented. Gabler is an exuberant, outgoing guy. Cassidy, very nice person, but she just couldn't match someone like Gabler. She's not out there howling.
Right.
Foxes don't howl. I mean, maybe they do. I don't think so, but so we have to address this. The question has come up, whether you're on social media or elsewhere, whether a woman playing Gabler's game would have won or a man playing Cassidy's game would have lost. Given the history of Survivor, in terms of how juries have sometimes viewed men's games and women's games differently, This is absolutely an appropriate question to ask. The problem is I don't know how we can answer it because there are so many variables.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that a kooky older woman tends to be looked at differently from a kooky older man.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that an under the radar man can sometimes make more of an impact than a similar under the radar woman. But the thing is that personalities are involved too. Cassidy herself said maybe Carla's personality was one reason people were taking her more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And in Australia, we saw a woman, that is Australian Survivor, we saw a woman pull off a similar feat of coming out of nowhere to win at Final Tribal Council. I mean, there were complicating factors there too, but there were similarities to Gabler here.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you wanted to, you could pick and choose individual situations for either side. I do not consider myself an expert in that level of sociological explanation or examination,
Right.
just in Survivor gameplay. What I can do here is judge and explain what we saw and heard.
Yeah.
But it is a valid question.
It's certainly a valid question. And it is definitely something that, as a player, I think I was surprised that it even came up as a thing, because when I was actually out there playing, I wasn't focused on that component of it. I wasn't focused on man, woman. I was looking at people's games. And then it was explained to me by another player that there was like, well, don't you see how many women are being voted out? And I was like, oh, like I hadn't even, that hadn't
Right.
even crossed my mind. But it is definitely a component of the game that is considered. And I hadn't been considering it. And I still didn't consider it moving forward. I wasn't going to be basing a vote on that, but it can happen. And so it is a combination of so many factors. And so there isn't one answer to this question, as you said, because there are so many additional components to it. I do think that there are parts of this game of Survivor that women don't get as much credit for, but then there are also parts of this game that women do get exceptional credit for. Immunity wins is something that I think is looked at a lot, where now it's become a little more, I think, almost an even playing field when it comes for women winning these immunity challenges. And there used to be this idea that the immunities were going to be won by the strongest man, and that's not happening anymore. That there's been a shift. And so maybe the playing field is being evened out a little bit, which is great. And maybe this is something that should not be the focal point of anything. It should just be about gameplay. But we also know that, as we've discussed, people are going to be judged for parts of themselves and how they present themselves and who they are. And this is part of who people are. And so whether or not that's going to affect the final decision and how you are going to be perceived, and do you get credit for this because you're a woman or not, or because you're a man or not, it really does depend on so many variables and factors.
Sorry.
That's all right.
I was going to say, and not conscious factors necessarily.
And that's what I'm saying. So for me, when I was playing the game, I wasn't considering that. That wasn't something that I was looking at. I was looking at the overall component of this person and the game that they were playing. And so it's something that could be there. It's something that could be relevant, and something that could not be relevant.
Right.
But we just don't know. And Cassidy, she said it in her final tribal, that she reminded them that she was the longest lasting woman in the game, and that she was taking credit for that. And she should. That is something that could be considered, but it doesn't have to be considered. And so it's a very difficult determination to make, and something that you just can't answer because there are so many components to it. For sure.
Right. Now, another issue that came up is the question of whether one or two people swung the jury. One reason this has come up, of course, is the issue we discussed back at the end of the first rule about Carla threatening to poison the jury. And the question of whether, even without intentionally doing that, she was saying negative things about Cassidy's game. This, of course, came up in Carla's own interviews, and she told Mike Bloom, I feel like people are going to say that it's me, but it's really not, because I don't have that power to sway the jury. But then later in the interview, she told Mike, I'm a good talker. I can convince a lot of people to do a lot of things.
Yeah.
Now, she was talking about different aspects. She was talking about within the game. But I also think we saw, yeah, she is good at convincing people. And even if she didn't come in and say, Cassidy's game sucks and here's why,
Right.
we know they did a jury roundtable. They all discussed what the finalists did and didn't do.
Mm-hmm.
It would absolutely make sense for them to talk to Carla about playing with Cassidy because they said they were fact checking things.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Jesse came in apparently upset at Cassidy as well.
Yeah.
So even without someone purposely going in and trying to sink her ship,
Mm-hmm.
everyone is human. Just like with the gender issue, everyone is human. You
Mm-hmm.
have your own inherent unconscious things going on that you may not even realize.
Mm.
And people can and will share their perspectives even if they're not actively trying to lobby.
Yes.
It's the
Yes.
way human beings work.
Yes. And I will say that someone who stands in front of juries and
Mm-hmm.
might just speak to juries, one of the components of speaking to a jury is you pay attention to how they are responding to you,
Right.
right? And if we look at that final tribal council, and regardless of anything that was said verbally about Cassidy and Gabler at this roundtable, all you had to do was watch the jury's
Mm-hmm.
response to Cassidy and Gabler. And if the person that you played this game with the closest is not excited when you speak, is not reaffirming what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying, is not saying that's absolutely true, that's going to have an effect.
Right.
Even though you haven't spoken a word, it is the mere way you are responding to that person. And the exact opposite was happening when Gabler would speak, where there
Right.
was that reaction and there was that affirmation happening. And that can certainly, certainly sway people because that is what you are feeling and that's what you are seeing at that
Mm-hmm.
time.
Yeah. And again, it doesn't have to be something conscious. It doesn't have to
Right.
be something done on purpose. If you are happy with someone, you remember the good things they did
Mm-hmm.
preferentially.
Yes.
If
Yes.
you are unhappy, you go the other way. I spent the last decade dealing with a boss who was totally like that. If
Mm-hmm.
if she liked someone, then the things that the person did wrong, she blew off. If she
Mm-hmm.
didn't like you, you could miss crossing one T and your whole document was crap, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, that is the way she is. And, it's just the way people are in general. You know, humans are complicated. It is
Yes.
easy to get caught up in a group think situation when you
Mm-hmm.
only have that group. That can explain why so many of them voted the same way, but Cassidy's closest ally didn't.
Yes.
Now, before anyone says anything, I will give the logical counterpoint to what I just said, because they could say, but David, couldn't it just be that James voted that way because he was the one who was biased in her favor? Maybe. I
Right.
can't say that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just basing my thoughts on how similar the overall games were and what we saw and heard.
Right. Yeah. All fair.
So, yeah, as we've discussed, it's not only about the strategic moves they made, it's also about convincing the jury.
Mm-hmm.
Again, every juror has the right to vote how they want.
Mm-hmm.
We have the right to consider whether we agree or not.
Right.
They were the ones that were out there. They interacted with Gabler and Cassidy and Owen.
Yeah.
They were almost certainly leaning heavily towards Gabler before the final tribal council, and his exuberant personality and explanations gave them what they were looking for.
Yeah. I agree.
All right. We've been at this for over 2 hours and 45 minutes.
We have been.
It is about time to wrap things up. What are your final thoughts?
Well, I have a sneaking suspicion that your final thoughts are going to be very thorough and rather awesome. So I am not going to spend a whole lot of time since it's 2 hours and 48 minutes in, but I will say this to Gabler, Cassidy, Owen, Jesse, and Carla. Thank you for competing this season. Thank you for being a part of season 43. We've discussed you a lot, and I hope you can appreciate the discussions. You put yourself out there, you put yourself in front of the world, and you allowed us to speak of you and speak about you and talk about your game. And you put it all out there for us, and we appreciate that. So while each of you played different games, and there were some similarities, and there's still some confusion as to the final result here, I do hope that David and I were able to go through it enough where we've answered some of your questions. But I just really want to thank you all, because I do appreciate you all as Survivor players. I've been there and I know how it feels. So thank you for entertaining us, for indulging us, and for giving us an opportunity to have this incredible podcast to speak about you. So I'm going to turn it over to you, David, because I'm very intrigued to see what you have put together. Very much.
All right. Yeah, this has been a very interesting path to follow. It took me longer than usual to figure it out. And as we've discussed, I still don't feel we have all the pieces. Maybe we never will. But we've got enough of that puzzle put together to see the overall picture. Before we get to that, this whole situation reminded me that I've been involved in discussions before where people wondered what would happen if someone who's considered a GOAT got to the end and suddenly proclaimed convincingly that they'd been running the game. Some might say that already happened once in Australian Survivor, and that person won. But as I mentioned earlier, there were some other circumstances related to how the jury may have felt about the opponent. But that situation is similar, if not an exact replica. Last week, we laughed because you, Jessica, had tweeted that Gabler said people didn't see the game he was playing, and you said that would be a hard sell to the jury. In retrospect, yeah, not so much.
Right? I was wrong.
And indeed, I did see what Gabler had done in accordance with what he said he was doing. He wasn't making it up. This wasn't some fever dream. It really happened. In his pregame interviews, he said he'd play the game like Sandra. He discussed being a genuine person, caring deeply about people, loving Rupert, being a team player, etc. He said he would not be super schemy. He wanted to be a good guy. And he thought that the longer he stayed, the more people would like him. And damn it if he wasn't right. He almost went out in the first vote, which would have been more in line with the predictions most people made about how he'd do. But he was saved from himself. It did take him a while to figure out what was going on and get things going. But once he did, he was able to make himself into such a non-threat that he was doing exactly what he proclaimed, hiding in plain sight. He literally told us what he was doing. He was the alligator, striking and then going beneath the surface. But many of us, myself certainly among them, still saw him as the weird guy who didn't fit in and was putting palm fronds on people. It may well be that's how the rest of the players saw him too, and why they didn't consider him to be a threat. But he became friends with almost everyone. In one way or another, he worked with almost everyone. Cassidy did too, but it was different. I think everyone really liked Cassidy, but they just maybe didn't have that same energy with her as they did with Gabler. He was a character come to life. Some would say a cartoon character come to life. Cassidy played her ass off. She worked with people. She was cunning like a fox. She knocked out people who came after her. She kept her threat level low, but she seemingly kept it too low in hindsight. Like a list of players I mentioned in Rule 1, jurors either didn't see what she had done or didn't want to see it. And she admitted that she, among others, underestimated Gabler's ability to connect with people. Owen also played hard. He just couldn't catch a break. He came into tribal council, final tribal council, knowing it was the longest of long shots. But even he thought Cassidy would win. He saw what we saw. And he spent the longest amount of time of anybody with Gabler. As for Jesse and Carla, they were the last two in a string of dominoes knocking out the biggest threats. I do find it interesting that a lot of what I'm seeing on social media are people saying Jesse shouldn't have made his big move and lowered his threat level, While we also see a lot of saying Cassidy didn't make a big move and didn't have enough of a threat level. Yes, Survivor is quite the balancing act. A big part is figuring out your best path to the end. Carla went with her best path. It didn't work. Jesse went with his best path. It didn't work. Owen went with his best path. It didn't work. Cassidy went with her best path. It didn't work. Gabler went with his best path. Surprise! I mentioned how one reason cited for voting Gabler the win went all the way back to his targeting of Ellie at the merge. And of course, the horrendous mention of firemaking. But in the end, it seemed like the jury liked Gabler more due to his social game and his ability to explain how he had fooled all of them without making them look foolish or taking anything away from their own games. He made strategic moves and he hid them well. Cassidy did too. But in the end, the jury had to make a decision among three people who had played mostly under the radar games. The final 5 immunity challenge puzzle phrase said, "You cannot hide in a dangerous game." Gabler absolutely proved that wrong. He was hiding in plain sight in a dangerous game while those who didn't do a good enough job hiding were knocked out. And one who did a good enough job hiding was criticized for hiding too much. And that is why Gabler won and Cassidy, Owen, Jesse, and Karla lost.
Excellent. See, I knew that was going to be phenomenal.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's see if we can finish this up under 3 hours here. Let me remind everyone, because it's been a while, that the rules we discussed are available in poster form, t-shirt form. Go to robhasawebsite.com/yxlostfeed, click through, order, bing, bang, boom, you're done.
That's right. Buy it. Love it. We'll ship it out. It'll be great.
Yes. And as a wrap up, now we don't have predictions, so I want to encourage people to check out the RHAP patron program at robhasawebsite.com/patron. There's still another patron Survivor Academy podcast coming. There's always the 5 for 5 and more. And of course, there's also the Facebook groups and Discord to keep you occupied with a great community of people, including, hello, both of us.
Hi.
You could talk about Survivor, Big Brother, life in general. So support shows like ours and everything on the network by becoming a patron at robhasawebsite.com/patron or click on the link at our YX Lost feed page. And once you get to the Facebook groups, make sure to say hello.
And you should also say hello to us on Twitter. It's still a thing. Yes, it's still out there. I am at Jessica Lewis 89 and he is at David Bloomberg. You should follow us both. We tweet throughout the week. We did live tweet during the episodes, and that was always fun, but we'll continue to do so even though Survivor's done. We're not walking away from Twitter yet. And David Bloomberg is on a lot of social media. He has a special page that links up to all of that as well, inclusive of his TikTok page, which is at David_Bloomberg. He definitely posts multiple videos a day. You should definitely check those out. And all of the other things that he has on his page, which he has up here, which is called what, David Bloomberg?
Linktree. So that is Linktree/David Bloomberg, except there's a dot before the EE. So it's linktree.ee/David Bloomberg. It's funny. I was listening to another podcast and they had created a Linktree and they said the same thing. They're like, yeah, I don't know why they do this. It's awkward, but it's Linktree with a dot before the EE.
There you go.
/David Bloomberg. And yeah, that way you only need to remember one thing, even if it is kind of a cumbersome thing. And so, yeah, that has all, like I said, all my different links, or like you said.
Yes.
Everyone should make sure you're subscribed to all the RHAP Survivor podcasts so that you get any post-season podcasts. You get ready for the next preseason in a couple of months. And again, you can get that by going to our YX Lost feed page. Also, just so you know, I mentioned last week that I had recently recorded another podcast with Spencer Watson for Truth Unrestricted. You can search that on wherever you get your podcasts. The topic was on manipulation and managing your actions to address how other people are thinking, which certainly goes along with Survivor play as well as other real world situations.
Yes, it does.
So I encourage people to check that out.
And I would like to thank Scott St. Pierre, who does all of the editing, not only for Why Blank Lost, but all of the podcasts that you listen to on RHAP. So thank you so much, Scott, for the incredible work that you do. We truly appreciate it. And this will be a long one for you. And
Yes.
then also, thank you to Will from America for the theme song that you did create for the Why Blank Lost podcast. It's super catchy and we love it. Thank you so much for that. And David Bloomberg, thank you for 3 hours of this incredible podcast that we just got through. And in addition to thanking David Bloomberg, I know that I've just thanked the final 5. I would also like to thank the entire cast of season 43 of Survivor. Thank you so much for, again, entertaining us and allowing David and I a platform to speak of you and about you. We truly appreciate it. And we love hearing from you. So feel free to reach out and let us know, were we right or were we wrong?
We were right. We were right. Do you
So
not
thank
see
you
the
very
sign?
much.
All
That's
right, yes.
right.
And thank you, Jessica. Yes, it was 3 hours after a lot of work for both of us. So thank you for that. We will again see everyone here in later this week with Voce and Tiffany. Get those questions in. Until then, bye.
Bye.